Part 2, The Foundation of the Philly Mob. Welcome to Deep Sleep, your first stop for original gangster stories. In the first part of the Philly Mob history, we discussed the time before the mob existed. This part is going to tell the story of Salvatore Sabella and the foundation of an organized Philadelphia crime family as we understand it today. Sabella's appointment as the Philadelphia capo of the New York D'Aquila family by their boss, Salvatore D'Aquila. I should remind you that the Philadelphia mob had not been recognized as an independent family by the Commission until 1946. By then, it was recognized as a subregime of the D'Aquila and Genovese families. Even after 1946, some sources claim they were still a subregime of the Genovese family, but we know from many sources that the Philly mob is recognized as an independent family, including the famous raid of the Apalachin meeting. On this part, we are also going to dig into their allies and rivalries in addition to the setup of the family. At the beginning of the Prohibition era, the Philly mob was not a major player, but was getting stronger every year. This point of view will be our foundation to understand the Calabrian-backed Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra's rise. Now, pick your sweetest spot and enjoy tonight's episode. Chapter 8. Let's meet Salvatore Sabella. In the closing years of the 19th century, along the northwestern coast of Sicily, the town of Castellammare del Golfo watched over the Tyrrhenian Sea. This ancient fishing village, with its Norman castle rising above the harbor, had seen centuries of foreign influence. Muslims from North Africa had once walked these streets. Norman French had left their architectural mark. But by 1891, when Salvatore Sabella entered the world, it was the invisible hand of the Mafia that truly governed Castellammare. Salvatore was born into what contemporaries would have called a respectable family. His parents, John and Rosa Sabella, occupied that uncertain space in Sicilian society, neither wealthy landowners nor desperately poor peasants. They were middle class by the standards of their time and place. This meant young Salvatore would learn to read. He would learn to write. He would understand numbers and basic arithmetic. These were privileges in a region where many still signed documents with an X. But education alone could not protect a family from the realities of Sicilian life. The Mafia was not simply a criminal organization in Castellammare. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence. It influenced who received contracts for public works. It determined which fishing boats secured the best positions in the harbor. It mediated disputes that the official courts could not or would not address. To live in Castellammare del Golfo was to live within this system, whether one participated in it directly or not. As Salvatore moved through his teenage years, his mother Rosa made arrangements that would shape his future in ways she could not have anticipated. She secured an apprenticeship for her son at a local slaughterhouse. This was honest work, skilled labor that could provide a steady income. In the early 1900s, butchery was a respected trade, requiring knowledge of anatomy, an understanding of meat preservation, and the physical strength to handle large animals. But the slaughterhouse brought young Salvatore face to face with a darker aspect of working life in Sicily. His employer, whose name has been lost to history, treated his apprentice with systematic cruelty. The details of this abuse have not been preserved in any surviving records, but we know that it was ongoing. We know that it was severe enough to push a young man to a desperate act. In 1905, at the age of 14, Salvatore Sabella killed his employer. The circumstances surrounding this incident remain unclear. Was it self-defense during a particularly violent confrontation? Was it a carefully planned act of revenge? The historical record is silent on these questions. What we do know is that Sicilian society and its legal system recognized some distinction in the case. Salvatore was not executed. He was not sentenced to life imprisonment. Instead, he was sent to Milan, far to the north, where he would serve 3 years in prison. The Milan prison system of the early 20th century was a world away from the sun-drenched streets of Castellammare. Here, among criminals from across Italy, Salvatore Sabella served his sentence. 3 years is a significant portion of any life, but for a teenager, it represents a formative period. The boy who entered Milan's prison walls in 1905 would emerge in 1908 as someone fundamentally changed. We cannot know what lessons Salvatore learned during those years. We cannot know what connections he might have made, what codes of conduct he absorbed, but we do know that when he returned to Sicily, he carried with him the mark of someone who had crossed a line that most people never cross. He had taken a life. He had survived the consequences. And he had learned that survival sometimes required violence. By 1912, Salvatore Sabella had made a decision shared by millions of Italians during that era. He would leave Sicily. He would cross the Atlantic Ocean. He would seek his fortune in America. The great wave of Italian immigration to the United States had been building for decades. Economic hardship in southern Italy drove this exodus. The promise of work in America's expanding industries pulled people across the ocean. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians would make this journey. Salvatore Sabella was one face in this enormous tide of humanity. He settled in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood that had become a transplanted corner of Castellammare del Golfo. This was not unusual. Italian immigrants clustered together based on their town of origin. Men from Palermo lived near other Palermitans. People from Naples sought out fellow Neapolitans, and those from Castellammare del Golfo found each other in the crowded tenements of Brooklyn, recreating the social networks of their hometown in this new world. In Brooklyn's Little Italy, Salvatore encountered a man who would alter the trajectory of his American life. Giuseppe Trainer, known to those who respected him as Don Giuseppe, operated at the intersection of legitimate business and underworld influence. His legal enterprise was the Empire Yeast Company, a business that supplied an essential ingredient to bakeries throughout New York. But Don Giuseppe's connections extended far beyond the world of commercial yeast production. He had business relationships that stretched down the eastern seaboard to Philadelphia, where a growing Italian community was establishing its own version of the old country's social structures. In Philadelphia's Little Italy, around South Street and the blocks radiating from the Italian market, a network was forming that mirrored the organizations back in Sicily. Giuseppe Traina recognized something in the young Salvatore Sabella. Perhaps it was his Castellammare background. Perhaps it was his demonstrated willingness to act decisively when pushed. Perhaps it was simply his competence in the various enterprises that Trainer oversaw. Whatever the reason, Don Giuseppe took Salvatore under his wing, providing guidance and opportunities that would have been unavailable to most recent immigrants. The year 1917 marks a turning point in Salvatore Sabella's story, though the exact details remain frustratingly vague. No official records document this transition, but the outcome is clear. Salvatore, along with 2 of his brothers, was sent to Philadelphia. This was not a random relocation. This was an assignment backed by one of the most powerful men in Italian-American organized crime. Salvatore D'Aquila controlled extensive operations in New York. He had earned the title that carried weight in the underworld, capo dei capi, boss of all bosses. This was not a formal position recognized by law, of course. It was a designation that reflected D'Aquila's influence, his ability to mediate disputes, his control over lucrative operations, and his connection to the old world power structures that many Italian immigrants still respected. When D'Aquila sent Salvatore Sabella to Philadelphia, he was extending his organization's reach southward. Philadelphia, with its growing Italian population and expanding industrial economy, represented opportunity. The city needed someone who could represent D'Aquila's interests, who could organize the various independent operators into a coherent structure, who could establish the kind of systematic control that D'Aquila had achieved in New York. Salvatore Sabella, at approximately 26 years old, became the representative boss of Philadelphia's organized crime operations. He was the face of the D'Aquila family in a new city, tasked with building what would become one of the most enduring crime families in American history. On January 6, 1919, As the world was still recovering from the Great War, Salvatore Sabella married Maria Galante. She was 21 years old to his 28. She too came from Castellamare del Golfo, maintaining the tradition of marrying within the community of origin. Maria came from what was carefully described as a good family, a phrase that carried specific meaning in this context. A good family, in the parlance of Castellamare society, meant a family with connections to the Mafia. It meant a family that understood the codes, the obligations, the unspoken rules that governed this parallel society. The Galante name itself carried weight. It is quite possible, though not definitively proven, that Maria was related to the same clan that would later produce Carmine Galante, who would himself become a notorious figure in organized crime. Salvatore and Maria settled into Philadelphia's Little Italy, establishing a household that would become the foundation of a dynasty. Over the years, they would have 6 children. Those children would eventually produce 13 grandchildren. The Sabella family was putting down roots in American soil, building a legitimate family life even as Salvatore navigated the dangerous waters of organized crime leadership. As 1920 approached, Salvatore Sabella stood at a unique moment in history. The United States was about to embark on one of its greatest social experiments, prohibition. The 18th Amendment would ban the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the entire nation. This well-intentioned attempt to improve American society would instead create the greatest criminal opportunity of the 20th century. Salvatore Sabella, with his Sicilian background, his mentorship under Giuseppe Traina, his backing from Salvatore D'Aquila, and his position as Philadelphia's representative boss, was perfectly positioned to take advantage of this opportunity. He had built the organizational foundation. He had established the necessary connections. He had proven his ability to lead. The Sicilian teenager who had killed his abusive employer in Castellamare del Golfo 15 years earlier had transformed himself into a significant figure in American organized crime. The 3 years in a Milan prison, the immigration to Brooklyn, the apprenticeship under Don Giuseppe, the move to Philadelphia, all of it had been preparation for what was to come. As the 1920s dawned, Salvatore Sabella was ready to build an empire. In our next chapter, we will explore how Salvatore Sabella navigated the opportunities and dangers of prohibition, how he built the Philadelphia crime family into a lasting organization, and how the skills learned in the slaughterhouses of Sicily would serve him in the very different kind of business he now conducted. But for now, rest easy, knowing that we've laid the foundation of this story, the journey of one man from a coastal Sicilian town to the streets of Philadelphia, carrying with him the codes, connections, and capabilities that would shape organized crime in America for generations to come. Chapter 9. The Sabella Crew, Power and Succession in South Philadelphia. In the warren of narrow streets that made up South Philadelphia's Italian neighborhood, a power structure had crystallized around Salvatore Sabella that would define organized crime in the city for decades to come. The men who formed his inner circle were not simply associates or soldiers. They were the architects of an organization that would outlive its founder, men whose names would echo through the criminal underworld long after Prohibition's repeal. John Avina stood at the center of this network. Born in Sicily in the 1890s, Avina had crossed the Atlantic like thousands of other immigrants, carrying with him the old world traditions of honor and organization that would serve him well in the New World shadow economy. By the mid-1920s, South Philadelphia knew him by a different name entirely. Big Nose. Avina had become synonymous with the numbers racket that flourished in the neighborhood's tenements and row houses. The numbers game represented a perfect criminal enterprise for the era. Italian immigrants, barred from many legitimate economic opportunities by language barriers and discrimination, eagerly participated in this daily lottery. For a few pennies, a worker could place a bet on a 3-digit number. If that number matched the last 3 digits of that day's stock market totals or racetrack handle, the payout could be substantial. The odds heavily favored the house naturally, but the small cost of entry and the dream of a big win made the numbers game wildly popular. Avina didn't create this system. Similar games had existed in Italian neighborhoods since before the turn of the century. What he did was organize it with ruthless efficiency. Under Sabella's protection and guidance, Avina built a network of numbers, runners who collected bets from barbershops, corner stores, and social clubs throughout South Philadelphia. The daily flow of cash was remarkable. Pennies and nickels from hundreds of small bets accumulated into substantial sums. The mathematical edge ensured profits, and the constant turnover of money provided an ideal vehicle for laundering the proceeds from alcohol operations. The biggest numbers man in South Philadelphia, the newspapers called him, and the description was accurate. Avina's operation dwarfed those of his competitors. He employed dozens of runners, maintained relationships with legitimate businesses that served as collection points, and paid out winnings promptly enough to maintain customer loyalty. In an era when trust was everything, Avina's word was considered reliable. Winners got paid. The system worked. But Avina's role went beyond running numbers. As Sabella's top lieutenant, he participated in the broader strategic decisions that shaped the family's direction. When territorial disputes arose, Avina helped negotiate resolutions. When new opportunities emerged, his counsel carried weight. He represented the younger generation within Sabella's organization, men who had grown up partly in America and understood both the old Sicilian ways and the new American methods. Giuseppe Dovi brought a different set of credentials to Sabella's inner circle. Born in Messina, Sicily, he arrived in Philadelphia using the name Joseph Bruno. Likely to distance himself from family complications back home, or simply to adopt a name easier for American officials to process. The choice of surname was unfortunate timing. In 1925, a different Joseph Bruno had been murdered in the street violence that preceded Sabella's consolidation of power. But Giuseppe Dovi's use of the Bruno name predated that killing and had no connection to the deceased man. What made Dovi valuable to Sabella was his connection to the Castellamares faction within the broader Italian organized crime world. The town of Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily had produced an extraordinary number of mafiosi who emigrated to America. They maintained tight bonds with each other, forming a network within the network. This Castellamares alliance would become crucial in the power struggles of the early 1930s, when conflicts between different Sicilian factions threatened to tear apart organized crime families across the country. Dovi rose through Sabella's organization steadily but without fanfare. He understood the value of operating quietly, of building influence through relationships rather than reputation. While Avina's numbers operation made him visible, Dovi worked in the background, managing the political relationships that kept the family functioning smoothly. He maintained connections with politicians, judges, and police officials whose cooperation the organization required. His legitimate front as a businessman provided cover for meetings that might otherwise attract attention. The role of political facilitator demanded particular skills. A man in Dovi's position needed to know when to apply pressure and when to offer incentives. He had to understand the motivations of the various public officials the family dealt with. Some men could be bought outright. Others required more subtle approaches, favors that created obligations without explicit corruption. Still others simply needed to be convinced to look the other way at opportune moments. Dovi's Castellamares connections also provided valuable intelligence about activities in other cities. The network of Sicilian immigrants maintained communication across the eastern United States. When conflicts brewed in New York or changes occurred in Chicago, word filtered through these channels. This early warning system gave Sabella's organization time to prepare for developments that might affect Philadelphia's criminal landscape. Joseph Ida represented the future, though few realized it in 1927. Born in Calabria on November 6, 1890, Ida had immigrated to Philadelphia as a young man. By the time of the Zanghi killing, he held a position of responsibility within Sabella's organization, though he remained peripheral enough that Zanghi didn't place him at the scene of the ambush. This positioning proved fortunate for Ida. While other members of the inner circle faced immediate scrutiny following the shooting, Ida continued operating without interruption. His arrest record remained clean. His name didn't appear in the newspaper coverage that detailed the activities of men like Avina and Paulina. This relative anonymity allowed him to build his position within the organization without attracting law enforcement attention. Ida's approach to organized crime emphasized patience and careful planning. He avoided the flashy displays that attracted police interest. His legitimate business interests provided genuine income alongside his criminal activities, creating a financial picture that could withstand scrutiny. He cultivated relationships across ethnic lines, understanding that successful criminal enterprises in Philadelphia required cooperation between Italian, Irish, and Jewish factions. The late 1920s saw Ida methodically expanding his influence. He developed revenue streams independent of alcohol distribution, recognizing that prohibition wouldn't last forever. Labor racketeering interested him particularly. Philadelphia's waterfront and markets offered opportunities for men who could control unions and extract tribute from businesses. Ida studied these industries carefully, identifying the pressure points where a well-organized crime family could insert itself profitably. Every criminal organization requires men willing to handle violence, and Luigi Quaranta filled this role within Sabella's crew. The details of Quaranta's early life remain obscure, lost in the gaps of immigration records and the deliberate obscurity that surrounded men in his line of work. What the historical record establishes clearly is his function within the organization and his eventual fate. Quaranta's designation as the crew's primary enforcer didn't necessarily mean he was particularly violent by nature. Rather, it indicated his willingness to carry out violent acts when the organization required them, and his competence in doing so. In the world of Prohibition-era organized crime, violence served specific purposes. It resolved disputes, enforced discipline, eliminated threats, and sent messages to rivals. Effective violence was calculated and purposeful, not random or emotional. The role demanded certain qualities beyond mere willingness to commit violent acts. An enforcer needed to remain calm under pressure, to follow orders precisely, and to keep silent if arrested. He had to understand the unwritten rules about when violence was appropriate and when it would create more problems than it solved. Killing the wrong person or acting without proper authorization could trigger wars between families or bring down intense law enforcement scrutiny. Quaranta's eventual sentence to life in prison testified to the risks inherent in his role. While the historical record doesn't detail the specific crime that led to his conviction, the lifetime sentence suggests either murder or a sufficiently serious violent offense committed in circumstances that precluded a lesser punishment. The criminal justice system of the era generally reserved life sentences for the most severe cases, particularly when prosecutors could prove premeditation and establish the defendant's prior criminal history. The fact that Quaranta received such a severe sentence, while other members of Sabella's crew avoided similar fates, points to the selective nature of law enforcement success against organized crime. Police and prosecutors struggled to build cases against higher-ranking members who insulated themselves from direct involvement in criminal acts. Men like Quaranta, who actually pulled triggers or wielded weapons, faced greater exposure to arrest and conviction. Dominic Antonio Paulina, known throughout South Philadelphia as Mr. Miggs, embodied the dual nature of organized crime figures in the era. His legitimate business, the Maggio Cheese Company, operated openly and profitably, serving the Italian community's demand for imported and domestic cheeses. Paulina could be seen making deliveries, negotiating with suppliers, and managing the everyday operations of a small food business. This legitimate enterprise provided more than just cover for Paulina's criminal activities. It offered a plausible explanation for his income, created opportunities for laundering money, and gave him reasons to travel and meet with various individuals without arousing suspicion. A cheese salesman might legitimately need to consult with suppliers, visit restaurants and grocery stores, and maintain relationships across the city's Italian neighborhoods. Paulina's arrest in 1927 following the Zhanghe shooting placed him squarely within Sabella's inner circle at a crucial moment. The police sweep that followed the ambush netted several men believed central to the organization's operations. That Paulina found himself among those arrested indicated law enforcement's understanding of his importance beyond his role as a cheese merchant. The Greaser Gang association that attached itself to Paulina's name reflected the ethnic prejudices of the era's journalism. Newspapers routinely used such derogatory terms to describe Italian criminal organizations, conflating ethnic identity with criminal activity. The label told readers nothing specific about Paulina's actual role or activities, serving primarily to the subjects of coverage, and appeal to readers' biases. What the historical record suggests about Paulina is a man who understood how to navigate between the legitimate and criminal worlds. His business acumen served him in both spheres. The same skills needed to run a successful cheese company, understanding supply and demand, managing employees, maintaining customer relationships, translated directly to organizing criminal enterprises. The legitimate business also connected him to a broad network of merchants, restaurant owners, and shopkeepers who either participated in or accommodated the family's activities. Dominic Festa's name appears consistently in the records from 1927, linked repeatedly to the core group involved in the Zhanghe shooting. His arrest in the post-shooting roundup placed him among those law enforcement considered most central to the operation. The pairing of his name with Quaranta and Scopoletti in police reports suggests the three men formed a working unit within the larger organization. Street captains like Festa occupied a crucial middle position in the family hierarchy. Above them stood the top leadership, Sabella, Avina, Dovi, who set policy and made strategic decisions. Below them worked the soldiers and associates who carried out day-to-day criminal activities. The captain bridged these levels, translating leadership directives into specific actions while managing the men who performed them. This role required both toughness and diplomatic skill. A captain had to command respect from subordinates while maintaining the confidence of superiors. He needed to resolve disputes among his crew members, ensure that operations ran smoothly, and deal with the practical problems that arose in any criminal enterprise. When collections fell short, when territory disputes erupted, when members violated organizational rules, the captain handled it. Festa's apparent partnership with Quaranta and Scopoletti in the Zhanghe operation reflected the specialized team approach that Sabella's organization employed for particularly sensitive matters. The ambush wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It required planning, coordination, and personnel with specific skills. By bringing together Festa's leadership, Quaranta's willingness to commit violence, and Scopoletti's driving ability, the organization assembled a unit capable of executing a complex operation. The precision of such arrangements distinguished professional criminal organizations from simple street gangs. Where gangs might react impulsively or employ whoever was available, Sabella's crew approached serious matters systematically. They assessed what needed to be done, determined who was best suited to do it, and coordinated the action carefully to minimize risk and maximize the chance of success. John Scopoletti, sometimes listed in records as Nicola, occupied a specialized but crucial position within the organization. Zhanghe's testimony to detectives identified Scopoletti's men as those who set the trap for him. Witness Francisco placed Scopoletti behind the wheel of the blue sedan used in the attack. These details establish him as a key operational figure, someone trusted with both planning and execution of sensitive actions. The role of driver in a criminal organization carried particular significance during the automobile age. Cars had transformed organized crime, providing mobility that horse-drawn vehicles couldn't match. A good driver could navigate city streets quickly, shape police pursuit, and position vehicles precisely for operations like the Zhanghe ambush. The skill set extended beyond merely operating a vehicle. It required knowledge of routes, awareness of police patrol patterns, and the ability to remain calm during dangerous operations. Scopoletti's designation as a local capo figure in press reports suggests his responsibilities went beyond driving. In organizational terms, a capo commanded his own crew, managing a team of soldiers and overseeing specific operations or territories. This dual role, both operational specialist and manager, made him particularly valuable. He could both plan operations and participate directly in executing them. The management of subordinates presented its own challenges. A capo needed to recruit reliable people, assess their capabilities accurately, and assign them appropriate tasks. He had to maintain discipline within his crew while protecting his men from outside threats. When disputes arose, he resolved them. When opportunities emerged, he exploited them. The successful capo balanced initiative with loyalty to the larger organization. Scopoletti's crew apparently included the men who prepared the Zanghi ambush site. This required surveillance to establish Zanghi's patterns, selection of an appropriate location for the attack, and positioning of personnel to ensure success. The fact that the ambush went according to plan demonstrated competent preparation. That it ultimately failed to eliminate the target reflected the difficulty of guaranteeing outcomes in such operations, not necessarily any failure of planning. Chapter 10. The Prohibition Era begins. As the 1920s dawned across America, the ratification of the 18th Amendment transformed the nation's social and economic landscape overnight. The Volstead Act, which took effect on January 17, 1920, prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States. What legislators had envisioned as a moral crusade to purify American society instead created the single greatest criminal opportunity of the 20th century. In Philadelphia, a city of nearly 2 million residents with deeply entrenched drinking traditions, the impact was immediate and profound. The city of brotherly love, with its hundreds of established saloons, breweries, and distilleries, suddenly found itself confronting an impossible directive. Citizens who had legally enjoyed a beer after work or a whiskey with dinner were now classified as criminals for maintaining these simple pleasures. For Salvatore Sabella, a man who had spent the previous decade building connections and establishing himself within Philadelphia's Italian community, prohibition represented not a moral question but a business proposition. The demand for alcohol hadn't disappeared with the stroke of a legislative pen. Instead, it had merely been driven underground, waiting for enterprising individuals to fill the void. By this time, Sabella had moved beyond his early struggles as a new immigrant. He had married, started a family, and cultivated relationships with various elements of Philadelphia's underworld. The young Sicilian who had arrived knowing no English now spoke the language fluently and understood the city's complex social dynamics. He had observed how power flowed through Philadelphia's neighborhoods, who controlled which territories, and where opportunities might emerge for an ambitious man willing to take calculated risks. Sabella understood a fundamental principle that would serve him throughout his criminal career. Successful illicit operations required legitimate facades. The appearance of respectability provided cover, offered plausible explanations for wealth, and allowed for the commingling of legal and illegal revenues in ways that frustrated law enforcement investigations. By 1920, he had established himself as an oil and cheese merchant, operating a business that served the Italian community's daily needs. The shop, located in South Philadelphia's densely populated immigrant neighborhoods, dealt in olive oil imported from Italy, various cheese varieties favored by Sicilian and Calabrian families, and other Mediterranean staples. The business was genuine in its operations, serving real customers with legitimate products. The oil and cheese trade offered several advantages for someone engaged in parallel criminal enterprises. First, it provided a plausible explanation for regular income and business expenses. Second, it necessitated wholesale purchasing and distribution networks that could be used for less legal commodities. Third, it required storage facilities where other goods might be kept away from prying eyes. Finally, it brought Sabella into daily contact with the Italian community, allowing him to identify potential associates, assess business opportunities, and maintain awareness of neighborhood developments. The merchant business also afforded Sabella a certain social status within the community. He was not merely a street criminal but a businessman, a provider of essential goods, someone contributing to the neighborhood's economic life. This reputation would prove valuable as he expanded his operations into more questionable territories. In addition to his oil and cheese operation, Sabella owned a soft drink cafe. In the early months of Prohibition, such establishments proliferated across American cities as displaced saloon owners, and bartenders sought legal alternatives to their suddenly criminalized professions. The soft drink parlor became an iconic feature of 1920s urban life, serving as both a legitimate business and, frequently, as a front for continued alcohol sales. Sabella's cafe operated on South Philadelphia's bustling commercial streets, where Italian immigrants gathered to socialize, conduct business, and maintain connections to their homeland's traditions. During daylight hours, the establishment functioned as advertised, serving fruit juices, sodas, coffee, and light food items to a steady stream of neighborhood customers. The cafe provided Sabella with something his oil and cheese business could not, a gathering place. Here, men could meet without arousing suspicion. Conversations could occur in the busy atmosphere where individual discussions were lost in the general din. Business could be conducted in plain sight, disguised as social interaction among friends and neighbors. For those in the know, the cafe offered services beyond carbonated beverages. Bootlegged alcohol could be discreetly purchased. Arrangements could be made for larger deliveries to private homes, social clubs, or speakeasies. Credit could be extended, debts collected, and partnerships formed. The cafe functioned as an informal headquarters for Sabella's growing criminal network, all while maintaining the appearance of a simple neighborhood gathering spot. Using his legitimate businesses as foundations, Sabella began building what would become known as a Sicilian bootlegging and extortion network. The ethnic designation was significant. Philadelphia's Italian criminal element had long been divided along regional lines, with Sicilians, Calabrians, and other groups maintaining distinct networks and sometimes competing interests. Sabella drew his closest associates from among Sicilian immigrants, men who shared his cultural background and understood the traditions of mutual obligation and silence that had governed criminal organizations in their homeland for generations. These were not random street criminals, but carefully selected individuals bound by ties of family, regional origin, and shared experience. The bootlegging operation itself was relatively modest compared to the massive importation and distribution networks that would develop later in the decade. Sabella's organization focused primarily on serving the Italian community's demand for wine and spirits. Alcohol was produced in small basement distilleries, imported through connections with other criminal groups, or hijacked from shipments moving through Philadelphia's port facilities. The extortion component of Sabella's operations followed patterns established in Italy and already present in American cities with large Italian populations. Merchants paid for protection, sometimes from genuine threats, sometimes from threats that would only materialize if protection payments ceased. The system relied on fear, certainly, but also on a twisted form of community obligation, where payments were framed as contributions to mutual security and neighborhood stability. As Sabella expanded his operations, he navigated a complex criminal landscape. Unlike cities such as New York or Chicago, where massive criminal organizations were already consolidating power, Philadelphia's underworld remained fragmented. Various groups controlled different rackets, territories, and criminal enterprises, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, rarely unified under single leadership. The Philadelphia mob, as it was beginning to be called, was not yet a major force in the bootlegging industry. The organization that would eventually become one of the most powerful crime families in the nation was still in its formative stages. While involved in alcohol distribution, the Philadelphia mob's bootlegging operations were dwarfed by those of other criminal enterprises in the city. Instead, The mob concentrated on rackets that required less capital investment and infrastructure than major bootlegging operations. Loan sharking provided steady income by extending credit at usurious rates to gamblers, small businessmen, and desperate individuals with nowhere else to turn. The interest rates were exorbitant, the collection methods harsh, but the demand remained constant. Gambling operations similarly required relatively modest investment while producing reliable returns. Numbers games, card rooms, dice games, and betting parlors flourished in working-class neighborhoods where residents sought escape from daily hardships and harbored dreams of sudden wealth. The house always won eventually, ensuring steady profits for those controlling the operations. These enterprises, loan sharking and gambling, formed the economic foundation of the Philadelphia mob during Prohibition's early years. They were less glamorous than bootlegging, less visible than the speakeasies and nightclubs that captured public imagination, but they were profitable and sustainable. In Philadelphia, bootlegging was dominated by two men who operated on a scale far beyond anything Sabella or the nascent Italian mob could match. Max "Boo Boo" Hoff and Mickey Duffy controlled the city's major alcohol distribution networks, supplying the high-end speakeasies, hotels, and restaurants that served Philadelphia's wealthy residents and visitors. His organization employed hundreds of individuals in various capacities, from dock workers who unloaded shipments to truck drivers who transported goods, from chemists who tested alcohol quality to enforcers who protected shipments and collected debts. Hoff also maintained extensive political connections, ensuring that law enforcement efforts against his operations remained limited and ineffective. Mickey Duffy, whose real name was William Michael Cusick, operated similarly large-scale bootlegging enterprises. Like Hoff, he had started in gambling before recognizing Prohibition's extraordinary profit potential. Duffy's organization controlled numerous breweries and distilleries in and around Philadelphia, producing thousands of gallons of alcohol weekly. Both Hoff and Duffy understood that dominating Philadelphia's bootlegging trade required more than just producing and selling alcohol. They needed to control distribution channels, maintain quality standards that kept high-end customers satisfied, manage relationships with corrupt officials, and defend their territories against encroachment by rival organizations. For Salvatore Sabella, attempting to compete directly with Hoff and Duffy's established operations would have been suicidal. Instead, he chose alignment. By working with, rather than against, the major bootleggers, Sabella could access supplies for his own distribution network while avoiding the costs and risks of large-scale production and importation. This arrangement proved mutually beneficial. Hoff and Duffy needed local distributors who could move product in ethnic neighborhoods where the major bootleggers lacked connections and cultural knowledge. Sabella needed reliable alcohol sources that he could distribute through his Sicilian network without investing in production infrastructure. The relationship was strictly business. Sabella purchased alcohol from Hoff and Duffy's organizations at wholesale prices, then distributed it through his own channels, taking his profit from the markup. He stayed in his lane, serving the Italian community and avoiding any encroachment on the major bootleggers' high-end markets. This strategic positioning demonstrated Sabella's business acumen. He recognized the limits of his organization's power and resources. Rather than overreaching and inviting conflict he couldn't win, he carved out a sustainable niche that provided steady income while maintaining growth potential. As his network expanded and his resources grew, he could reassess his position. But in 1920, alignment made more sense than competition. Not all of Sabella's relationships in Philadelphia's underworld were cooperative. While he worked harmoniously with Hoff and Duffy, he found himself in rivalry with the Lanzetta brothers, another Italian criminal organization operating in South Philadelphia. The Lanzetta brothers, Ignatius, Willie, Leo, Lucian, Tio, and Pius, controlled various criminal enterprises in the city's river wards and adjacent neighborhoods. Like Sabella, they were involved in bootlegging, though on a somewhat larger scale. They also operated gambling dens, engaged in robbery, and maintained their own extortion networks. The rivalry between Sabella's organization and the Lanzettas stemmed from territorial overlap and competing claims to control over Italian criminal activities in South Philadelphia. Both organizations recruited from similar populations, operated in overlapping geographic areas, and competed for the same criminal opportunities. However, the nature of this rivalry during the early 1920s remained relatively restrained. Open warfare would attract law enforcement attention neither organization wanted. Instead, the competition manifested through business maneuvering, recruiting of key associates, and occasional confrontations between lower-level members of the respective organizations. The Lanzettas represented a more significant threat to Sabella's operations than did distant competitors. They were immediate neighbors, drawing from the same community, competing for the same resources. The rivalry would simmer throughout the decade, occasionally boiling over into violence but never erupting into the full-scale gang war that characterized organized crime conflicts in other cities. While the Lanzetta brothers posed a serious competitive challenge to Sabella's organization, another figure operated on the periphery of Philadelphia's Italian underworld with considerably less sophistication. Anthony Muskie, Zanghi, was what older criminals dismissively called a street thug, someone who relied on violence and intimidation rather than organization and business acumen. Zanghi lacked the structured operations that characterized Sabella's network, the Lanzetta brothers' organization, or the major bootlegging enterprises of Hoff and Duffy. He was an independent operator, gathering around him a small crew of similarly minded individuals who engaged in robbery, assault, and small-scale extortion. The nickname Muskie apparently derived from his personal hygiene habits, or lack thereof, though the precise origin remains unclear in historical records. What is clear is that Zanghi operated at a much lower capacity than the established criminal organizations in Philadelphia. He was more criminal than businessman, more predator than entrepreneur. The mob had issues with Zanghi, though the precise nature of these conflicts remains somewhat vague in historical documentation. Most likely, Zanghi's activities created problems for more established operations. His crude extortion methods might have frightened potential marks who were already paying protection to more sophisticated organizations. His robberies might have targeted businesses that enjoyed protection from other criminal groups. His violent tendencies might have attracted law enforcement attention that threatened everyone's operations. For organized criminals like Sabella, figures like Zanghi represented an irritating complication rather than a serious threat. They were unpredictable, uncontrollable, and likely to create problems that affected more than just themselves. They operated outside the informal systems of cooperation and territorial respect that allowed multiple criminal organizations to coexist in the same city. Dealing with someone like Zanghi presented challenges. He wasn't powerful enough to require formal negotiation or strategic planning, yet he was problematic enough that ignoring him completely wasn't viable. The solution often involved making clear that certain activities would not be tolerated, that certain territories were off-limits, and that certain individuals enjoyed protection that would be enforced. As 1920 progressed into 1921 and beyond, Sabella's criminal organization continued its steady evolution. The early Prohibition years were a time of opportunity and experimentation, when criminal entrepreneurs tested various approaches to profiting from America's noble experiment in legislated morality. Sabella's organization grew through careful recruitment and strategic expansion. New associates were brought in based on trust, capability, and connections. Territory was expanded incrementally, avoiding overreach that might provoke responses from larger, more powerful criminal organizations. Profits were reinvested in both legitimate and illegitimate enterprises, building a financial foundation for future growth. The structure remained relatively informal during these early years. Sabella led through personal relationships and reputation rather than through formal hierarchies. His word carried weight because he had demonstrated reliability, capability, and willingness to use violence when necessary, but also restraint when prudent. His legitimate businesses continued to serve as foundations for illegal operations. The oil and cheese merchant provided cover and legitimate income. The cafe functioned as a social hub and informal headquarters. Both enterprises allowed for the laundering of illegal profits into apparently legal revenues, making it difficult for law enforcement to determine the true source of Sabella's wealth. During the early 1920s, law enforcement efforts against bootlegging and organized crime remained relatively ineffective. Philadelphia's police department, like those in cities across America, struggled to enforce prohibition laws that much of the public ignored or actively resented. Corruption was widespread. Police officers supplemented modest salaries by accepting payments from bootleggers in exchange for advance warning of raids, overlooking violations, or providing protection during deliveries. Politicians received campaign contributions from individuals whose wealth derived from illegal alcohol sales. Judges proved remarkably lenient when bootleggers appeared in their courtrooms. For organizations like Sabella's, operating at a relatively modest scale and serving primarily an ethnic community, police attention remained minimal. Officers focused their limited enforcement efforts on large-scale operations or high-profile speakeasies, not on small neighborhood distributors serving immigrant populations. Federal prohibition agents, while less susceptible to local corruption, were vastly outnumbered and concentrated their efforts on major trafficking routes and large commercial operations. A small-time bootlegger like Sabella, moving limited quantities through personal networks, barely registered on federal enforcement priorities. This relatively permissive environment allowed Sabella and similar criminals to develop their operations without facing sustained law enforcement pressure. As long as they avoided high-profile violence, kept their operations relatively discreet, and maintained appropriate political connections, they could operate with substantial impunity. Within Philadelphia's Italian immigrant community, Sabella occupied a complex position. To some, he was a respected businessman, a successful immigrant who had achieved prosperity in America. To others, he was a necessary evil, someone who provided services the community wanted, but the law prohibited. To still others, he was a criminal who preyed upon his own people through extortion and violence. This ambiguity was typical of organized crime figures in immigrant communities during this era. They were simultaneously insiders and outsiders, community members and community threats. They spoke the language, understood the culture, and often provided assistance to newly arrived immigrants or families facing hardship. Yet they also demanded payments, enforced compliance through violence, and created problems that affected everyone in the neighborhood. Sabella navigated these contradictions through a combination of generosity and menace. He contributed to community causes, helped struggling families, and presented himself as a successful businessman who had risen through hard work and determination. Simultaneously, he made clear that crossing him or interfering with his operations would result in severe consequences. This approach was not unique to Sabella, but rather reflected patterns established by criminal organizations in Italian immigrant communities throughout America. The neighborhood boss was expected to fulfill certain social obligations, protecting the community from outside threats, helping families in need, maintaining order in exchange for tolerance of his criminal activities and willingness to provide assistance when required. By the early 1920s, Sabella's criminal organization operated on a business model that would remain relatively consistent throughout his career. Multiple revenue streams ensured that problems in one area didn't threaten the entire operation. Legitimate businesses provided cover and legal income. Strategic alliances with larger criminal organizations provided security and access to resources. Bootlegging provided the most dramatic profits but also carried the highest risks. Alcohol production and distribution violated federal law, attracted law enforcement attention, and invited competition from rival organizations. Sabella's relatively modest role as a distributor rather than producer or importer limited both his potential profits and his exposure to risk. Extortion provided steadier, more predictable income. Monthly payments from merchants and businesses created cash flow that didn't depend on successful production or delivery of illegal goods. The collection process was straightforward, and the victims were unlikely to cooperate with law enforcement given their own vulnerabilities and the certainties of retaliation. Loan sharking similarly offered reliable returns with manageable risks. The loans were technically legal, only the interest rates and collection methods violated norms, if not always laws. Borrowers were often desperate individuals or habitual gamblers unlikely to seek police assistance. Defaults could be handled through increased interest, seizure of assets, or physical intimidation. Gambling operations required more infrastructure and faced more direct law enforcement scrutiny, but they also attracted steady customer flow and generated substantial profits. The house advantage ensured profitability over time, and the periodic raids and arrests were anticipated costs of business. Geography played a crucial role in Sabella's operations during these early years. South Philadelphia's Italian neighborhoods were densely populated, with residents living in close quarters in row houses and tenement buildings. Commercial corridors featured small shops, cafes, and businesses serving the immigrant population's needs. This dense urban environment facilitated both legal and illegal business. Customers were concentrated in limited geographic areas, making distribution efficient. Word of mouth spread quickly through tight-knit communities. Trust networks based on regional origin, family connections, and shared experience created foundations for criminal organizations that valued secrecy and loyalty. However, this same density created complications. Multiple criminal organizations operated in overlapping territories. Disputes over control could erupt quickly given the close proximity of rival groups. Law enforcement presence, while often corrupt or ineffective, was nonetheless constant and visible. Sabella's organization concentrated its operations in specific neighborhoods within South Philadelphia, where Sicilian immigrants predominated and where he had established connections and reputation. Expanding beyond these core territories required either negotiation with other criminal groups or willingness to engage in conflict to enforce claims. During the early 1920s, Sabella generally chose consolidation over expansion, strengthening his position in areas where he already operated rather than aggressively pursuing new territories. This conservative approach minimized conflict with rival organizations while building a foundation for future growth. While Sabella built his organization in Philadelphia, similar processes were occurring in cities across America. Prohibition had created a nationwide criminal industry worth billions of dollars annually. In New York, various Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs competed for control of bootlegging and related rackets. In Chicago, Al Capone's organization was beginning its rise to dominance. In Detroit, the Purple Gang controlled alcohol smuggling from Canada. Philadelphia's criminal landscape, while significant, operated on a smaller scale than these major centers. The city's geographic position between New York and the Mid-Atlantic region provided opportunities for alcohol trafficking, but also meant that larger criminal organizations from other cities occasionally operated in Philadelphia's territory. Sabella and other Philadelphia criminals needed to maintain awareness of these larger national developments. Alliances formed in one city might affect operations in another. Violence in New York might send displaced criminals to Philadelphia seeking new opportunities. Changes in smuggling routes or law enforcement priorities in one region could impact operations elsewhere. This national context meant that even locally focused criminals like Sabella couldn't operate in complete isolation. They needed to maintain connections with criminals in other cities, stay informed about developments in the broader organized crime landscape, and position their organizations to adapt to changing circumstances. The early Prohibition years represented a foundation-building period for Salvatore Sabella's criminal career. He established the businesses, relationships, and operational methods that would characterize his organization for years to come. He learned to navigate Philadelphia's complex criminal landscape, balancing cooperation and competition with various organizations. He demonstrated the qualities that would eventually make him a significant figure in Philadelphia's underworld, strategic thinking that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term gains, willingness to work within existing power structures rather than immediately challenging them, and understanding of when violence was necessary and when restraint served better. His legitimate businesses provided cover for illegal operations while also offering genuine services to the community. His criminal enterprises generated profits that were substantial without being spectacular, allowing for growth without attracting undue attention. His position aligned him with powerful organizations like those of Hoff and Duffy while maintaining independence and control over his own operations. The rivalry with the Lanzetta brothers remained manageable, simmering rather than boiling over. The issues with Anthony Muskie Zhang were irritating but not threatening. The fragmented nature of Philadelphia's criminal landscape created space for multiple organizations to operate without necessitating immediate consolidation or elimination of rivals. As the early 1920s progressed, prohibition became increasingly entrenched despite widespread violation and growing public skepticism about its effectiveness. The criminal organizations that had emerged to supply prohibited alcohol became more sophisticated, more organized, and more violent. What had started as relatively opportunistic distribution of illegal products was evolving into structured criminal enterprises operating on business principles. For Sabella, the coming years would present both opportunities and challenges. His organization would need to grow to remain competitive with larger, more powerful criminal groups. He would need to navigate an increasingly violent landscape as competing organizations fought for control of lucrative territories and rackets. He would need to balance his traditional Sicilian approach to criminal organization with the demands of operating in an American urban environment. The foundations he built during these early Prohibition years would serve him well. The legitimate businesses would continue providing cover and income. The relationships with major bootleggers like Hoff and Duffy would provide access to supplies and markets. The Sicilian network would offer loyal associates bound by ties stronger than mere financial interest, but success would require more than maintaining what he had built. It would require growth, adaptation, and increasing sophistication of operations. The small-time bootlegger and extortionist of 1920 would need to transform into something larger, more organized, more powerful. The fragmented criminal landscape of early Prohibition Philadelphia would eventually consolidate, with smaller organizations either absorbed by larger ones or eliminated entirely. Salvatore Sabella's journey through this transformation was just beginning. The oil and cheese merchant with a cafe and a modest bootlegging operation would eventually become the recognized boss of Philadelphia's Italian mob. But in the early 1920s, that future remained uncertain. The foundations were being laid, the skills developed, the relationships formed. The rest would depend on opportunity, strategy, and survival. The start of Prohibition transformed America and created unprecedented opportunities for criminal entrepreneurs willing to defy the new legal regime. In Philadelphia, Salvatore Sabella recognized these opportunities and positioned himself to exploit them through a combination of legitimate business fronts and criminal operations. His oil and cheese merchant business and soft drink cafe provided the cover for a growing Sicilian bootlegging and extortion network. While the Philadelphia mob wasn't yet a major player in bootlegging compared to organizations like those of Max Boo Boo Hoff and Mickey Duffy, it was active and growing. Strategic alignment with the major bootleggers provided access to supplies and markets while avoiding self-destructive competition. Rivalry with the Lanzetta brothers and issues with figures like Anthony Muskie Zhang complicated but didn't threaten Sabella's operations. The fragmented criminal landscape of early Prohibition Philadelphia allowed multiple organizations to coexist, compete, and occasionally cooperate. The foundations laid during these early years would prove crucial as Prohibition continued and organized crime in Philadelphia evolved into more structured, powerful, and violent forms. For now, Sabella was building, learning, and positioning himself for whatever opportunities the decade ahead might bring. As Philadelphia settled into the reality of Prohibition, with its speakeasies, bootleggers, and corrupt officials, Salvatore Sabella's criminal organization was establishing itself as a permanent feature of the city's underworld. The journey from small-time bootlegger to recognized mob boss was underway, though the ultimate destination remained to be determined. Chapter 11. Max "Boo Boo" Hoff, the king of Philadelphia's bootleggers. Max Hoff, despite his colorful nickname, was a sophisticated criminal entrepreneur. Born in South Philadelphia to Jewish immigrant parents, he had risen from street-level gambling operations to become one of the most powerful bootleggers on the East Coast. Hoff controlled importation routes from Canada and Europe, operated breweries disguised as industrial facilities, and maintained distribution networks reaching throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. By his teenage years, Max Hoff had begun to understand the intricate economy of the streets. Gambling houses operated openly in many neighborhoods, their presence tolerated by authorities who received regular payments for their discretion. Bookmakers took bets on horse races and prize fights. Numbers runners collected pennies and nickels from working people hoping for a windfall. These enterprises existed in a space between legal and illegal, accepted as part of the neighborhood fabric while officially forbidden by law. The boxing world would provide Hoff's entry into broader criminal enterprise. In the early 20th century, prize fighting occupied a curious position in American society. Officially banned or heavily restricted in many jurisdictions, boxing nonetheless attracted massive public interest and generated substantial revenue. Promoters, managers, and fighters operated in a world where official disapproval coexisted with popular enthusiasm. By the late 1910s, Max Hoff had built one of Philadelphia's most successful boxing operations. He managed a stable of fighters, promoted regular bouts at venues throughout the city, and maintained the necessary relationships with officials and media figures. His success in the prize-fighting business demonstrated talents that would serve him well in the larger criminal enterprises to come: organizational ability, political connections, and an understanding of how to operate profitable ventures in legally ambiguous territories. By 1920, Max "Boo Boo" Hoff had established himself as a significant figure in Philadelphia's underworld. His gambling operations generated steady revenue. His boxing promotion business provided both income and a veneer of legitimacy. His political connections offered protection from unwanted official scrutiny. He had built a foundation of operational expertise, financial resources, and useful relationships. And then, on January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the nation. This single act of legislation would transform American organized crime, creating opportunities for enormous profits and unprecedented criminal organizations. For Max Hoff, prohibition represented the chance to build an empire. Max Hoff recognized the scale of this opportunity before most of his competitors. While prohibition officially began in January 1920, the process of implementation had been visible for months beforehand. The Volstead Act, passed in October 1919 to enforce the 18th Amendment, gave advance notice of the coming dry era. Smart operators began positioning themselves for the transition. Hoff's initial move was characteristically shrewd. Rather than immediately diving into bootlegging, he established a legitimate business that would provide both cover and infrastructure for alcohol operations. The Franklin Mortgage and Investment Company opened its doors in downtown Philadelphia, presenting itself as a respectable financial services firm. The location was carefully chosen, close to the city's business district, in a building that suggested prosperity and legitimacy. Hoff's bootlegging organization itself was built on principles learned from his gambling and boxing operations. He understood the importance of organization, the necessity of political protection, and the value of appearing legitimate while conducting illegal business. His approach to the bootlegging trade reflected these lessons. Hoff notably operated a legitimate business producing perfumes and cosmetics, which provided both cover and access to industrial alcohol supplies. Hoff's distribution system relied on a network of trusted individuals, many of them drawn from Philadelphia's Jewish community, but also including Irish, Italian, and other ethnic groups. These distributors received product from Hoff's warehouses and delivered it to customers, collecting payment and returning the money to Hoff's organization. The system required trust, discipline, and efficient record-keeping to prevent theft and ensure that everyone received their proper share. By the mid-1920s, Max Hoff's bootlegging operation had grown to dominate Philadelphia's illegal alcohol trade. His organization supplied the majority of the city's speakeasies and controlled the most profitable distribution territories. The volume of alcohol moving through his network was enormous. Thousands of cases of liquor and beer every week, generating millions of dollars in annual revenue. This success brought Hoff increasing prominence in the broader world of American organized crime. Bootlegging had created wealthy, powerful criminal organizations in every major American city. In New York, figures like Arnold Rothstein and Charlie Luciano controlled vast operations. In Chicago, Al Capone's organization was becoming legendary. In Detroit, the Purple Gang dominated the liquor trade. In each city, bootlegging had created criminal enterprises larger and more sophisticated than anything that had existed before Prohibition. These various criminal organizations needed to coordinate their activities. Territories had to be respected. Disputes had to be resolved. Opportunities for cooperation had to be explored. The bootlegging trade, despite being illegal, required the same kind of business coordination and negotiation that legitimate industries employed. In May 1929, approximately 30 of the most powerful bootleggers and organized crime figures in America gathered in Atlantic City, New Jersey, for what would become known as the Atlantic City Conference. The meeting brought together the leaders of the nation's major criminal organizations to discuss common concerns and establish principles for cooperation. Among those in attendance were Al Capone from Chicago, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello from New York, Mo Dalitz from Cleveland, and various other prominent figures from around the country. Max Hoff attended this conference as the representative of Philadelphia's bootlegging interests. He was joined by other Jewish gangsters from Philadelphia, including Waxy Gordon, Harry Stromberg, Irving Bitts, Charles Schwartz, and Samuel Lazar. Their presence at this gathering confirmed Philadelphia's importance in the national bootlegging network and Hoff's status as a major figure in organized crime. The Atlantic City Conference addressed several key issues facing the bootlegging industry. The increasing violence of gang wars was attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement and the press. The murder of bootleggers and the battles for territory were making headlines and creating pressure for greater enforcement efforts. The conference participants agreed to avoid unnecessary violence and to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. The meeting also addressed the economics of the bootlegging trade. Participants discussed maintaining price stability, coordinating supply chains, and avoiding competition that might drive down profits. These criminals were, in effect, operating a cartel to control the illegal alcohol market. The principles they established helped to reduuse conflict and increase profitability for all participants. For Max Hoff, the Atlantic City Conference represented the apex of his criminal career. He sat alongside the most powerful gangsters in America as an equal, a recognized leader of one of the nation's major bootlegging operations. His journey from the streets of South Philadelphia to this gathering of criminal elites represented an extraordinary rise to power and wealth. Back in Philadelphia, Hoff's empire continued to expand. His boxing promotion business remained active, now operating alongside his bootlegging operations. By the late 1920s, he had assembled one of the largest stables of fighters in the nation. This legitimate business provided both income and respectability, allowing Hoff to present himself as a successful sports promoter while his primary profits came from illegal alcohol. The money generated by bootlegging required sophisticated laundering to be useful. Hoff couldn't simply deposit millions of dollars in cash without raising questions. His solution involved multiple businesses and financial institutions. The Union Bank and Trust Company, a legitimate Philadelphia bank, received substantial deposits from Hoff's operations. Real estate investments provided another avenue for moving cash into apparently legitimate assets. Properties purchased with bootlegging profits could be resold, with the proceeds appearing to come from lawful real estate transactions. Hoff's real estate holdings grew throughout the 1920s. He purchased apartment buildings, commercial properties, and land throughout Philadelphia and the surrounding region. These investments served multiple purposes. They provided income, they laundered illegal profits, and they created visible evidence of success that supported Hoff's image as a legitimate businessman. His personal lifestyle reflected his enormous wealth. He maintained a fine home in a prestigious neighborhood. He dressed well, drove expensive automobiles, and was seen at the best restaurants and clubs. He attended sporting events, theatrical performances, and social gatherings where Philadelphia's elite assembled. To many observers, Max "Boo Boo" Hoff appeared to be simply a successful businessman who had prospered through legitimate enterprise. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, Hoff's operations faced constant challenges. The bootlegging business was inherently unstable, dependent on maintaining relationships with corrupt officials, avoiding aggressive law enforcement, and managing competition from rival organizations. Any disruption to these careful arrangements could threaten the entire enterprise. Philadelphia's bootlegging trade, despite Max Hoff's dominance, was never his exclusive domain. The enormous profits available from illegal alcohol attracted competitors from various ethnic groups and neighborhoods throughout the city. While Hoff had successfully established himself as the leading bootlegger by the mid-1920s, he faced constant pressure from rivals seeking to carve out their own territories and operations. The Irish gangs of Philadelphia represented Hoff's most persistent competition. The city's Irish community had a long history of political organization and street-level activity. Irish political machines controlled many neighborhoods. Irish police officers were well represented in the department, and Irish gangs had experience with various criminal enterprises dating back to the 19th century. Among the most notable of these Irish operators was Hugh McClune, known as Huey to his associates. McClune's path into bootlegging followed a uniquely American trajectory. As a young man, he had worked as the mascot for the Philadelphia Athletics baseball team, a visible and somewhat light-hearted position that gave him local recognition. This early exposure taught McClune valuable lessons about public relations and the importance of maintaining a popular image. After his time with the Athletics, McClune transitioned into the speakeasy business. He operated drinking establishments in Irish neighborhoods, initially purchasing his alcohol supply from various sources, including, at times, Max Hoff's organization. But as the bootlegging trade grew more profitable, McClune recognized the advantages of controlling his own supply chain. He began working with other Irish operators to import and distribute alcohol, gradually building an organization that competed directly with Hoff's operations. McClune's speakeasies were popular establishments, known for good liquor, reasonable prices, and a welcoming atmosphere. He cultivated relationships throughout Philadelphia's Irish community, positioning himself as a neighborhood businessman rather than a criminal. This local support provided protection and facilitated his business operations. Daniel O'Leary represented another significant Irish presence in Philadelphia's bootlegging trade. O'Leary's organization operated in different neighborhoods than McClune's, but the two Irish operators maintained friendly relations and occasionally cooperated on larger shipments or shared intelligence about law enforcement activities. Together, they represented a substantial challenge to Hoff's dominance. The competition between Hoff's Jewish organization and the Irish bootlegging operations was complex. It wasn't a simple story of ethnic conflict or territorial warfare. In many respects, the different organizations coexisted peacefully, each maintaining their own territories and customer bases. Jewish speakeasies in South Philadelphia received deliveries from Hoff. Irish establishments in other neighborhoods dealt with McClune or O'Leary. Neutral territory, downtown hotels, upscale clubs, and commercial districts saw competition, but this was generally managed through pricing and service rather than violence. However, the enormous profits available from bootlegging created inevitable tensions. When a speakeasy owner decided to switch suppliers in search of better prices or more reliable service, the change could be interpreted as a hostile act. When delivery trucks from competing organizations crossed paths in disputed territories, confrontations might occur. When ambitious individuals within one organization sought to expand into areas controlled by rivals, conflict could result. The gambling business added another layer of complexity to these relationships. Hoff, McLoone, and O'Leary all operated gambling houses in addition to their alcohol businesses. The gambling trade had its own territories and protocols, sometimes aligning with bootlegging territories and sometimes cutting across them. A neighborhood might receive its liquor from one organization, while its gambling operations were controlled by another. Throughout the mid-190s, these various tensions remained largely under control. Philadelphia avoided the spectacular gang violence that plagued Chicago, where the rivalry between Al Capone's organization and the North Side Gang led to numerous murders, including the famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. The bootleggers of Philadelphia generally recognized that open warfare attracted law enforcement attention and threatened everyone's profits. But by 1928, the competitive pressures were intensifying. The bootlegging trade had been operating for 8 years, and the major organizations had become entrenched in their territories. Opportunities for peaceful expansion were diminishing. Ambitious individuals within each organization were pressing for more aggressive approaches, and the personal relationships between leaders, which had helped maintain peace, were beginning to fray under the strain of competition. On a spring evening in 1928, Hugh McLoone was driving through Philadelphia when another vehicle pulled alongside his car. Gunfire erupted, and McLoone was shot multiple times. The drive-by shooting was a dramatic escalation in violence, importing tactics more common in Chicago to Philadelphia's streets. McLoone died from his wounds, becoming one of the most prominent bootlegging casualties in the city's history. The murder of Hugh McLoone sent shockwaves through Philadelphia's underworld and the city at large. McLoone's past as a baseball mascot and his local popularity made his death front-page news. The brazen nature of the drive-by shooting suggested that the peaceful coexistence among bootlegging organizations was breaking down, and the murder raised urgent questions about who was responsible and what retaliation might follow. The response came swiftly. Daniel O'Leary, whether seeking revenge for his Irish compatriot or targeted for his own competitive position, was shot in a subsequent incident. He survived his wounds, but the message was clear. The violence that had been largely absent from Philadelphia's bootlegging wars had arrived with deadly force. These shootings marked a turning point in Philadelphia's criminal landscape. The murders attracted intense media coverage, with newspapers publishing detailed accounts of the shootings and speculating about gang wars and bootlegging rivalries. Editorial writers demanded action from law enforcement. Civic groups called for investigations. The public attention that bootleggers had successfully avoided for most of the Prohibition era suddenly focused on their activities with uncomfortable intensity. The political establishment faced growing pressure to respond. For years, Philadelphia's politicians and police officials had maintained a comfortable arrangement with the city's bootleggers. Regular payments had ensured that speakeasies operated openly, that alcohol flowed freely, and that criminal organizations conducted their business with minimal interference. But the McLoone murder and the subsequent violence made this tolerance politically untenable. In August 1928, a special grand jury was convened to investigate corruption in Philadelphia's police department and its connections to bootlegging operations. The Special August Grand Jury, as it became known, represented a serious threat to the arrangements that had protected bootleggers like Max Hoff for years. Grand juries had the power to subpoena witnesses, examine financial records, and compel testimony under oath. They operated with fewer restrictions than regular criminal investigations and could pursue evidence wherever it led. The grand jury investigation quickly revealed the extent of corruption within Philadelphia's police department. Witnesses testified about regular payments from bootleggers to police officers. Financial records showed that officers at every rank had received money from criminal organizations. The connections between political leaders and bootlegging operations became public knowledge. The findings were damning. The grand jury concluded that 138 police officers were unfit for service due to their involvement with bootleggers and their acceptance of corrupt payments. These officers represented all ranks and assignments, from beat cops to high-ranking officials. The investigation documented how Max Hoff and other bootleggers had systematically purchased protection from law enforcement. The evidence against Hoff was particularly detailed. Witnesses testified about delivering payments to police officials on Hoff's behalf. Records showed gifts and favors flowing from Hoff's organization to public officials. The Franklin Mortgage and Investment Company's role as a front for bootlegging operations was exposed. The grand jury's final report specifically named Max Hoff as a central figure in the corruption of Philadelphia's police department. The public revelations from the Special August grand jury investigation transformed Philadelphia's political and criminal landscape. The 138 officers deemed unfit for service were dismissed or forced to resign, representing the largest cleanup of a police department in the city's history. Political leaders who had protected bootleggers found themselves facing intense scrutiny and potential prosecution. The comfortable arrangements that had allowed bootlegging to flourish were suddenly subject to public examination and condemnation. For Max Hoff, the grand jury investigation marked the beginning of a long decline. His carefully constructed protection network had been destroyed. The political relationships that had shielded his operations were now liabilities rather than assets. The public exposure of his bootlegging empire made it impossible for officials to continue tolerating his activities. The king of Philadelphia's bootleggers found his throne crumbling beneath him. Chapter 12. Mickey Duffy, the last Irish boss of Philadelphia. In the early decades of the 20th century, Philadelphia's criminal underworld belonged to the Irish. For generations, the sons of Irish immigrants had controlled the speakeasies, the gambling dens, and the protection rackets that flourished in the city's working-class neighborhoods. Among these men, few would rise as high or fall as hard as the man known as Mickey Duffy. He was born William Michael Cusick, though that name would fade from memory as his reputation grew. The year of his birth remains uncertain, lost to the incomplete records of immigrant communities. But what is known is that he came from Polish-American stock, despite the Irish surname he would adopt for the streets. In those days, an Irish name carried weight in Philadelphia's underworld. It opened doors. It commanded respect. And so William Cusick became Mickey Duffy, a transformation that would define his destiny. The details of the incident remain murky, preserved only in court records and fading newspaper clippings. But sometime in the years before 1922, Mickey Duffy was involved in an attempted murder. The circumstances, the victim, the precise nature of the assault, these particulars have been lost to time. What matters is the outcome. He was caught, convicted, and sent to prison. The American penal system of the 1920s was not designed for rehabilitation. It was a holding pen, a place where young criminals learned from older ones, where connections were made and grudges were born. Mickey Duffy emerged from prison in 1922, a more dangerous man than when he entered. But he also emerged into a changed world, one filled with opportunity for men of his particular skills. The 18th Amendment had been ratified in 1919. The Volstead Act had followed, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the United States. Prohibition, as it came to be known, was perhaps the greatest gift ever given to organized crime. Overnight, it transformed a legal industry worth billions into an illegal enterprise worth even more. And into this new landscape stepped Mickey Duffy, fresh from prison and ready to make his fortune. Mickey Duffy proved himself adept at every aspect of this enterprise. He understood that bootlegging was fundamentally a logistics problem, and he approached it with the methodical attention to detail that characterized successful businessmen, whether their enterprises were legal or otherwise. He established supply lines. He cultivated relationships with importers who could bring quality liquor in from Canada and the Caribbean. He built a distribution network that extended from Philadelphia south to Atlantic City and throughout South Jersey. But Mickey Duffy's real innovation was his understanding of vertical integration. He didn't just sell beer and liquor to speakeasies, he owned the speakeasies themselves. This gave him control over the entire chain of distribution, from supply to final sale. Each club, each speakeasy, each illicit drinking establishment that bore his mark was both a customer and an asset. The profits flowed upward, concentrating in his hands. The crown jewel of his empire was Club Cadix, a nightclub in Philadelphia that became synonymous with his name and his power. In an era when speakeasies operated in shadowy basements and hidden back rooms, Club Cadix stood as a monument to Mickey Duffy's success and his defiance of the law. It was elegant by the standards of the time, a place where the city's sporting crowd mingled with its underworld figures, where champagne flowed freely despite prohibition, where jazz bands played until dawn. The club's very existence was a statement. It said that Mickey Duffy had reached a level of power where he no longer needed to hide. It said that he had the political connections necessary to operate openly. It said that he was protected, untouchable, at the peak of his influence. But in the bootlegging business, success bred competition, and competition, in the absence of legal recourse, led inevitably to violence. While Mickey Duffy was building his empire in Philadelphia and South Jersey, he was not operating in isolation. The bootlegging business in the Mid-Atlantic region was dominated by several major figures, each controlling their own territory, each pursuing their own strategies for profit and power. In Philadelphia, the most significant of these figures was Max Hoff. Known as Boo Boo Hoff, he was a former boxing organizer who had transitioned into bootlegging and had built one of the most successful operations in the city. Hoff's approach differed from Mickey Duffy's in several important ways. Where Mickey was aggressive and confrontational, Hoff preferred negotiation and political influence. Hoff had cultivated relationships with city officials, police commanders, and other figures in positions of authority. He paid his bribes regularly and generously. He avoided unnecessary violence. And for many years this approach served him well. The relationship between Mickey Duffy and Max Hoff was complex. They were not exactly allies, but neither were they open enemies. They competed for territory and market share, but they also recognized the value of avoiding all-out war. The bootlegging business was profitable enough for both of them, provided they could establish clear boundaries and stick to them. But in the late 1920s, Max Hoff's position began to weaken. The political winds were shifting. Reform-minded officials, responding to public pressure about corruption and crime, began to crack down on the most visible bootlegging operations. Hoff, whose entire strategy depended on political protection, suddenly found himself vulnerable. He faced legal troubles, raids on his warehouses, arrests of his key lieutenants. For Mickey Duffy, Max Hoff's difficulties represented opportunity. As Hoff's organization contracted, territory became available. Customers who had once bought from Hoff needed new suppliers. The beer business in Philadelphia, long dominated by Hoff's operation, was suddenly up for grabs, and Mickey Duffy moved aggressively to seize it. By the late 1920s, Mickey had become the #1 figure in the Philadelphia beer trade. His distribution network extended throughout the city and into the surrounding areas. His speakeasies and nightclubs were among the most popular in town. His income, though impossible to calculate precisely, must have been substantial. He had achieved a position that few bootleggers ever reached. He was the boss, the primary operator, the man in charge. But his expansion into Philadelphia proper brought him into closer proximity with his rivals. The Boo Boo Gang and the Lanzetta brothers, already hostile, now found Mickey Duffy operating on their doorstep. The stage was set for a confrontation that would almost cost him his life. February 1927 brought a winter evening like many others in Philadelphia. The city was deep in the Prohibition era, its streets lined with speakeasies and nightclubs operating in open defiance of federal law. At Club Cadix, Mickey Duffy was preparing to leave for the night. It had been a successful evening. The club had been full, the liquor had flowed, the money had been good. Mickey was accompanied by his bodyguard, a necessary precaution in his line of work, and a doorman was on duty at the entrance. What happened next would mark a turning point in Philadelphia's underworld. Not because it was unusual, assassinations were common enough, but because of the weapon used and the dramatic escalation it represented. As Mickey Duffy emerged from Club Cadix, two men were waiting, Francis Bailey and Peter Ford, operatives working for rival interests. The details of the conspiracy remain unclear. Who ordered the hit? What was the specific grievance? These questions would never be fully answered. What is known is that Bailey and Ford were armed with a weapon new to Philadelphia's streets. Though it would soon become infamous throughout the American underworld, the Thompson submachine gun. The Thompson, often called the Tommy gun, was a recent development in firearms technology. Designed during World War I for use in trench warfare, it arrived too late to see significant military action, but it found an eager market in Prohibition-era America. The Thompson could fire up to 600 rounds per minute. It was devastating at close range, turning any confrontation into a massacre, and it was about to be used in Philadelphia for the first time. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. The Thompson's distinctive sound, a rapid hammering percussion that would become the soundtrack of the gangster era, shattered the night. Mickey Duffy was hit 3 times. His bodyguard went down. The doorman was struck as well. The shooters disappeared into the darkness, leaving their victims bleeding on the sidewalk. But Mickey Duffy survived. The wounds were serious, but none were immediately fatal. He was rushed to a hospital, where doctors worked through the night to save his life. The bullets were removed. The bleeding was controlled. And after weeks of recovery, Mickey Duffy returned to the streets, more determined than ever to maintain his position. The attack had several important consequences. First, it demonstrated that Mickey Duffy's enemies were willing to use extreme measures to eliminate him. The Thompson gun represented an escalation in firepower that changed the calculations of underworld conflict. Where previously a pistol or revolver had been the standard weapon, now automatic weapons were entering the picture. Second, Mickey's survival enhanced his reputation. In the underworld, a reputation for toughness was currency. To be shot 3 times and return to business was a powerful statement. It said that Mickey Duffy could not be intimidated. It said that he was resilient, perhaps indestructible. It reinforced his image as a man to be feared and respected. Third, the attack intensified the ongoing conflicts between the various bootlegging factions. Mickey Duffy's response to the assassination attempt was predictable. He struck back at his enemies, targeting those he believed responsible. This led to a cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation that would continue for years. By 1931, Mickey Duffy had been operating at the top of the Philadelphia underworld. He had survived assassination attempts, legal troubles, and constant warfare with rivals. He had built an empire based on bootlegging and nightclubs. He had accumulated wealth and power. But he had also accumulated enemies, and the list of those who wanted him dead was long. On August 30th, 1931, Mickey Duffy was staying at the Ambassador Hotel in Atlantic City. Why he was there, who he was meeting with, what business he was conducting, these details remain unclear. What is known is that on that August evening, someone entered his room and shot him dead. The assassination was professional and decisive. There was no struggle, no opportunity for defense. Mickey Duffy, who had survived so much, who had seemed almost invulnerable, was killed in a moment. The police investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. Suspects were questioned, theories were developed, but no prosecution resulted. One name that emerged during the investigation was Frankie Carbo. Carbo was a rising figure in organized crime, an enforcer who would eventually become associated with the Lucchese crime family, and would later gain notoriety for his control over professional boxing. Some believed that Carbo had carried out the hit on Mickey Duffy, either on his own initiative or at the direction of someone higher up in the underworld hierarchy. But nothing could be proven, and Capo was never charged with the crime. The death of Mickey Duffy marked more than just the end of one man's criminal career. It represented a fundamental shift in the power structure of Philadelphia's underworld, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. For decades, the Irish had dominated organized crime in Philadelphia. They had controlled the rackets, the political machines, the protection operations. They had built their power on numbers, on neighborhood loyalty, on a shared ethnic identity that bound them together against outsiders. But by 1931, this dominance was ending. The Sicilian Mafia, organized into what would become known as the Bruno Scarfo crime family, or the Philadelphia crime family, or as the Philly mob that we love much, had been growing in strength throughout the 1920s. These organizations, modeled on the crime families of New York and other major cities, were more structured, more disciplined, more businesslike than the Irish gangs. They had a hierarchy, a code of conduct, a system for resolving disputes without constant warfare. Mickey Duffy's assassination was a catalyst for this transition. With the most powerful Irish bootlegger dead, with the various Irish factions weakened by years of internal conflict, the Sicilians moved to consolidate their control. It did not happen overnight. There were still Irish operators, still independent crews and bootleggers. But the trajectory was clear. The future of organized crime in Philadelphia belonged to the Mafia. This transition mirrored changes happening across the United States. The old ethnic gangs, Irish, Jewish, Polish, were giving way to more sophisticated criminal organizations. The bootlegging business, which had enriched the previous generation, was about to end with the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. New rackets, labor racketeering, drug trafficking, gambling required new approaches and new organizations. Mickey Duffy did not live to see these changes. He died at the height of his power, master of a criminal empire that would not survive him. His death was violent, as perhaps he had always expected it would be. In the bootlegging business, few men retired peacefully. Most either went to prison or died in the streets. Mickey Duffy's end came quickly, without warning, in a hotel room far from the Philadelphia neighborhoods where he had built his reputation. Chapter 13, The Lanzetta Wars, Naples versus Sicily. The Philadelphia underworld of the 1920s was defined not merely by the struggle against prohibition agents and rival bootleggers, but by something far older and more entrenched: the ancient divide between Sicilian and Neapolitan immigrants. While both groups had fled poverty in southern Italy for the promise of America, they brought with them centuries of mutual distrust. In Philadelphia's crowded South Side neighborhoods, where brick row houses pressed together along narrow streets, these old-world tensions would erupt into a decade-long war that would reshape the city's criminal landscape. The Lanzetta brothers represented everything the Sicilian Mafia traditionally viewed with suspicion. They were Neapolitans, known in Italian communities as Napoletani, and they operated with a different code, a different structure, and different ambitions than the tightly organized Sicilian families, where the Sicilians emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and carefully controlled territories. The Lanzetta brothers pursued aggressive expansion and diversification into the most profitable criminal enterprises available. There were 6 Lanzetta brothers in total, each playing a distinct role in their family's operations. Leo, the eldest, served as the de facto leader and strategic mind behind their expanding empire. Pius handled much of the day-to-day business operations, managing the complex web of payoffs, collections, and enforcement that kept their enterprises running. Willie focused on muscle, the physical enforcement and protection rackets that secured their territory. Ignatius, known for his volatile temper, became the family's enforcer for particularly troublesome problems. Lucien managed their growing network of legitimate business fronts, providing the appearance of respectability. And Teo, the youngest, was being groomed to eventually take over leadership as his older brothers aged. By the mid-1920s, the Lanzetta organization had established dominance over 2 of Philadelphia's most lucrative criminal markets, narcotics and prostitution. While bootlegging captured the public imagination during Prohibition, it was actually drugs and vice that provided the most reliable profits with the least overhead. The Lanzettas controlled a network of brothels and opium dens throughout South Philadelphia, concentrated in the blocks between 7th and 9th Streets south of Lombard. This territory put them in direct geographical proximity to the Sicilian Mafia's traditional strongholds, a proximity that made conflict virtually inevitable. The narcotics business in 1920s Philadelphia was still relatively unsophisticated compared to later decades. The Lanzettas primarily dealt in morphine, cocaine, and opium, with their supply chains running through the city's busy port district. Ships arriving from Mediterranean ports, particularly from southern Italy and Turkey, provided a steady stream of contraband that moved through corrupt customs officials and waterfront workers. The Lanzettas had cultivated relationships with longshoremen's unions and maintained their own crew of dock workers who could ensure certain cargo containers went uninspected. Their prostitution empire was more visible and required more active management. The brothers controlled approximately 20 establishments scattered throughout South Philadelphia, ranging from high-end parlor houses that catered to wealthy businessmen and politicians to rough street-walking operations in the city's seedier districts. This network required constant supervision, protection from both law enforcement and rival operators, and regular payments to police officers, ward politicians, and city officials, who ensured the businesses could operate with minimal interference. For Salvatore Sabella and the Sicilian Mafia, the Lanzettas represented multiple threats. First, there was the territorial issue. The Neapolitans operated in neighborhoods the Sicilians considered their exclusive domain. Second, their focus on drugs and prostitution contradicted the more traditional Sicilian approach of controlling rackets like bootlegging, gambling, and labor unions. Many older Sicilian mafiosi viewed narcotics as a particularly dishonorable business, though this moral distinction would fade in later decades. Third, and perhaps most critically, the Lanzetta's success demonstrated that the Sicilian monopoly on organized crime was not as absolute as Sabella wished to maintain. The tension between these two organizations had been building throughout 1924 and early 1925. There were minor territorial disputes, instances where Lanzetta operatives would extend their drug-dealing operations into traditionally Sicilian neighborhoods, and conflicts over protection money from businesses that both groups claimed jurisdiction over. These were small conflicts resolved through intermediaries and negotiated settlements, but they created an atmosphere of mounting hostility. Joseph Bruno, known throughout South Philadelphia simply as Joe, had been one of Sabella's most trusted and capable lieutenants. He had risen through the ranks during the violent consolidation of power in the early 1920s, proving himself both loyal and ruthlessly effective. Bruno's primary responsibility was managing the Sicilian family's bootlegging operations in the southern portions of their territory, precisely the area where Lanzetta influence was strongest. Bruno was a traditionalist in the Sicilian mold. He believed in the old codes, the importance of respect and protocol, and the supremacy of Sicilian organization over what he viewed as Neapolitan chaos. His crew controlled several illegal breweries and maintained relationships with speakeasy owners throughout South Philadelphia. The bootlegging business required careful coordination, securing supplies of grain alcohol, managing distribution routes, collecting payments, and ensuring that retail outlets remained loyal to a single supplier rather than shopping among competing organizations. In the months before his death, Joe Bruno had been increasingly aggressive in pushing back against Lanzetta incursions. When Lanzetta dealers began selling narcotics in speakeasies that purchased alcohol from Bruno's operation, he issued warnings. When those warnings were ignored, he reportedly ordered beatings of several Lanzetta associates. The message was clear. The Sicilians would not tolerate the Neapolitans expanding their influence in what Sabella's organization considered their exclusive territory. The Lanzetta brothers, however, were not men who responded well to threats. They had built their organization precisely by refusing to acknowledge traditional boundaries and protocols. From their perspective, South Philadelphia was an open market, and any group, that wanted to maintain control needed to defend it actively rather than rely on old-world traditions of respect and deference. The evening of August 18, 1925, was warm and humid, typical for Philadelphia in late summer. The streets of South Philadelphia were crowded with residents seeking relief from the heat in their cramped row houses. Families sat on stoops. Children played in the streets. Vendors pushed carts selling Italian ices and fresh fruit. It was a Tuesday evening, and the neighborhood was alive with the usual sounds of city life conversations in Italian and English, street musicians, the occasional backfire of an automobile. Joe Bruno was making his regular evening rounds, visiting speakeasy owners and beer distributors to collect payments and ensure operations were running smoothly. He traveled with a single associate, as was his custom, enough protection to handle minor problems, but not so much security as to attract unwanted attention from police. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, Bruno's car stopped at the intersection of 8th and Catherine Streets, in the heart of what was considered neutral territory between Sicilian and Neapolitan spheres of influence. What happened next occurred with shocking speed and violence. As Bruno stepped from his vehicle, multiple gunmen emerged from a nearby doorway and opened fire. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets, sending pedestrians diving for cover and mothers screaming for their children. The assassins used handguns, firing repeatedly at close range with the clear intention of ensuring their target did not survive. Joe Bruno was struck 14 times. The wounds covered his torso, arms, and legs, a testament to the assassin's determination and the sheer volume of ammunition expended. He collapsed on the cobblestone street as his attackers fled into the maze of South Philadelphia's alleys and row houses, disappearing before police could respond to the shooting. Bystanders, despite the underworld nature of the violence, immediately called for help. An ambulance arrived and transported the critically wounded Bruno to Howard Hospital, one of the city's major medical facilities. Doctors worked frantically to save his life, but the damage was too severe. Joe Bruno died from his injuries, becoming one of the most significant casualties in the growing war between Sicilian and Neapolitan organized crime factions. The police investigation that followed was both vigorous and ultimately futile. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, but the code of silence that governed South Philadelphia's Italian neighborhoods proved impenetrable. Those who had seen the shooting claimed to remember nothing useful. The gunman had moved too quickly. The evening light had been too dim. They had been too frightened to notice identifying details. This pattern of public amnesia was standard in underworld killings, where cooperation with police was viewed as far more dangerous than remaining silent. However, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, police officers responding to the scene encountered Ignatius Lanzetta in the vicinity. Ignatius himself had been wounded, shot during the exchange of gunfire, though whether by Bruno's associate returning fire or by one of his own family's shooters in the chaos remained unclear. The police arrested Ignatius at the scene, charging him in connection with Bruno's murder. This arrest represented both a tactical mistake and a strategic problem for the Lanzetta organization. Ignatius was known for his hot temper and aggressive approach to business disputes, making him exactly the type of family member who might personally participate in a retaliatory hit. His presence at the murder scene, combined with his gunshot wound, provided police with rare physical evidence linking the Lanzettas to the killing. However, as was typical in underworld murder cases of this era, the evidence ultimately proved insufficient for prosecution. Without witnesses willing to testify and without any murder weapon recovered, the case against Ignatius Lanzetta gradually fell apart. The exact legal outcome of his arrest remains somewhat murky in historical records, whether charges were formally dropped, whether he was acquitted at trial, or whether the case simply languished in the court system until it was quietly abandoned. What is clear is that Ignatius Lanzetta did not serve significant time for Joe Bruno's murder. For Salvatore Sabella and the Sicilian organization, Joe Bruno's assassination represented not merely the loss of a valued lieutenant, but a direct challenge to their authority and prestige. In the world of organized crime, particularly within the honor-bound culture of the Sicilian Mafia, such a brazen killing demanded swift and decisive retaliation. To allow the murder to go unanswered would signal weakness, potentially encouraging other rivals to test the limits of Sicilian power. The response needed to be proportional, public, and unmistakable in its message. Sabella convened meetings with his senior leadership to plan the appropriate response. These gatherings likely took place in the back rooms of legitimate businesses, in private social clubs, or in the homes of trusted members, locations where discussions could occur without risk of police surveillance. The decision was made to target the leadership of the Lanzetta organization directly. Rather than killing a lower-level member in tit-for-tat retaliation, they would strike at the family's head, Leo Lanzetta himself. Leo Lanzetta, at the time of his death, was in his early 40s and had been the guiding force behind his family's rise in Philadelphia's underworld. He was known as a strategic thinker, someone who preferred negotiation and careful planning over impulsive violence. This temperament had served the Lanzettas well, allowing them to expand their operations through a combination of business acumen and selective use of force. Leo maintained a lower profile than some of his more volatile brothers, preferring to work behind the scenes while others handled public-facing aspects of the business. The fact that Leo preferred a more reserved approach may have contributed to his vulnerability. Unlike some underworld figures who surrounded themselves with constant security and varied their routines to prevent ambush, Leo maintained relatively predictable habits. He was known to visit the same barbershop regularly, an establishment at 7th and Bainbridge Streets, deep in South Philadelphia's Italian neighborhood and not far from Lanzetta strongholds. 4 days after Joe Bruno's murder on August 22, 1925, Leo Lanzetta followed his usual Saturday routine. He arrived at the barbershop in the early afternoon when the establishment would be busy with regular customers getting their weekly grooming. Barbershops in Italian neighborhoods served as more than just places for haircuts. They were social centers where men gathered to discuss business, politics, and neighborhood gossip. Leo likely felt secure in this familiar environment, surrounded by people from his own community. The Sabella assassins, whose specific identities remain unknown to history, demonstrated professional planning in their attack. They waited until Leo concluded his appointment and stepped out onto Bainbridge Street. The timing was critical. Inside the shop, Leo would have been surrounded by potential witnesses and innocent bystanders. On the street, there would be a brief window of opportunity when he was exposed, but before he could reach his vehicle or retreat to safety. As Leo Lanzetta emerged from the barbershop, the gunmen opened fire. The attack occurred in broad daylight, on a busy street, with numerous witnesses present. This public nature of the killing was itself a message. The Sicilians wanted the entire neighborhood to understand that they could strike anywhere, anytime, regardless of how public the location. The brazenness of the hit was meant to terrify rivals and reassure allies that Sabella's organization remained dominant. Leo Lanzetta was struck multiple times and died at the scene. The assassins fled immediately, again disappearing into the network of alleys and row houses that made South Philadelphia's Italian neighborhoods a maze for pursuing police. The killing occurred with such speed that bystanders had little time to react or intervene. By the time police arrived, responding to reports of gunfire, the shooters were long gone. The murder of Leo Lanzetta transformed what had been a simmering territorial dispute into an open war between Sicilian and Neapolitan factions. For the remaining Lanzetta brothers, their eldest brother's death was both a personal tragedy and an organizational crisis. Leo had been their strategist, the brother who tempered the more violent impulses of men like Ignatius and Willie with careful planning and long-term thinking. Without his moderating influence, the family's response would be driven more by rage than calculation. The feud that erupted in the wake of these two murders would dominate Philadelphia's underworld for the remainder of the 1920s. It was characterized by periodic eruptions of violence, shootings, bombings, beatings, interspersed with periods of tense peace. The conflict was never total war in the sense that all operations ceased in favor of fighting. Both organizations continued their criminal enterprises even as they engaged in intermittent combat with each other. The Sicilian-Neapolitan nature of the conflict added layers of complexity that went beyond simple business rivalry. In South Philadelphia's Italian community, families had to navigate divided loyalties based on their regional origins. Sicilian immigrants and their descendants generally supported Sabella's organization, while those from Naples and the surrounding Campania region tended to sympathize with the Lanzettas. This ethnic dimension meant that the conflict touched nearly every aspect of Italian-American life in the neighborhood, from which businesses received community support to which families intermarried. The war also had practical implications for criminal operations. Bootlegging, gambling, and other rackets require a certain amount of stability and predictability to function profitably. When neighborhoods are gripped by periodic gun battles, when key operatives are being assassinated, when police pressure increases in response to public violence, all of these factors disrupt business. Both the Sicilian and Neapolitan organizations saw their profits decline during the most intense periods of conflict. Law enforcement's response to these murders was hampered by the same challenges that made prosecuting organized crime consistently difficult. Witnesses refused to cooperate, evidence was scarce, and the suspects had the resources to hire skilled attorneys and exploit every procedural protection. Philadelphia police had established a Black Hand Squad specifically to deal with Italian organized crime. But these specialized detectives often found themselves frustrated by the code of silence that governed the community. Some police officials recognized that the conflict between Sicilian and Neapolitan factions could potentially be exploited to law enforcement's advantage. If the two groups were focused on fighting each other, they would be less able to corrupt police officers, intimidate witnesses, or operate their criminal enterprises efficiently. However, this strategy of allowing rival criminals to weaken each other had significant costs. Innocent bystanders were sometimes caught in crossfire, neighborhoods lived in fear, and the public violence undermined general community safety. The years following the 1925 murders saw periodic flare-ups of violence as old scores were settled and new grievances emerged. The Lanzetta brothers, despite losing their eldest sibling, proved remarkably resilient. They maintained their control over narcotics and prostitution networks, adapted their operations to account for increased security needs, and continued to challenge Sicilian dominance in South Philadelphia. For the Sicilian organization, the conflict with the Lanzettas was one of several challenges facing Salvatore Sabella's leadership. He was simultaneously managing bootlegging operations, dealing with challenges from within the Sicilian community itself, and attempting to maintain alliances with organized crime groups in other cities. The Lanzetta War consumed resources and attention that might otherwise have been devoted to expanding the organization's influence and profitability. As the 1920s progressed toward the 1930s, the broader landscape of American organized crime was changing. The Prohibition era, which had created unprecedented opportunities for criminal profits, was moving toward its conclusion. Forward-thinking criminals were already planning for the post-Prohibition world, identifying new rackets and revenue streams that could replace bootlegging. The extended conflict between Sicilians and Neapolitans in Philadelphia left both organizations somewhat unprepared for these coming changes. The feud continued sporadically throughout the late 1920s and into the early 1930s. Various Lanzetta brothers and Sicilian members would be killed or wounded in shootings over the years. Bombs would occasionally explode outside businesses or homes affiliated with one faction or the other. Beatings and intimidation remained common. However, the intensity of the conflict never quite matched those initial murders in August 1925, those killings that had transformed a business dispute into a blood feud. Chapter 14, The Tale of Anthony Muskie, Zanghi, the first informant of Philadelphia. Anthony Salvatore Zanghi entered the world on September 12, 1899, in the heart of Philadelphia's rapidly expanding Italian district. He arrived as the eldest of what would eventually become 13 children. a staggering number even by the standards of immigrant families of that era. His parents had made the arduous journey from Italy seeking the promise of America, only to find themselves crowded into the narrow row houses south of Market Street, where Italian was spoken more commonly than English, and old world customs held firm against the tide of American modernity. As Anthony moved through childhood and into adolescence, certain traits began to define his character. Those who knew him in these early years remembered an arrogant bearing, a quick temper, and a fundamental refusal to accept his station in life. Where other immigrant sons might resign themselves to factory work or trade apprenticeships, Anthony Zanghi seemed determined to carve out something more, something faster. The streets offered opportunities that the legitimate world did not. By his late teens and early 20s, Zanghi had established himself as a recognizable figure in the neighborhood, but not in ways that brought pride to his family. He was known as a troublemaker, a young man who seemed to seek out conflict rather than avoid it. This combative personality would serve him well in certain circles and poorly in others. In the emerging world of organized crime, confidence was valuable, but arrogance could be deadly. Those who rose highest in the Philadelphia Mafia of this era often possessed a certain diplomatic quality, an ability to forge alliances and show respect to those who demanded it. Anthony Zanghi, it seemed, possessed little interest in such subtleties. The Philadelphia of Anthony Zanghi's youth was a city in transformation. The passage of the Volstead Act in 1919, enforcing prohibition, had created unprecedented opportunities for those willing to operate outside the law. Suddenly, the simple act of providing people with beer, wine, or spirits, substances that had been perfectly legal just months before, could generate enormous profits. Italian neighborhoods with their established networks of social clubs and family connections became natural centers for bootlegging operations. By the mid-1920s, Anthony Zanghi had established himself as the proprietor of the La Tosca Cafe, located at the corner of 9th and Fitzwater Streets. The cafe sat in the geographic heart of Little Italy, just blocks from the bustling Italian market, and surrounded by the row houses where Italian immigrants had built their community. It was a strategic location, and the cafe itself served multiple purposes. On its surface, the La Tosca Cafe functioned as any neighborhood gathering place might. Men stopped by for espresso and conversation. Card games ran in the back room. News from the old country was shared and discussed. But like many such establishments during Prohibition, the cafe also served as a front for other activities. Whether Anthony was running a small-scale bootlegging operation, offering backroom gambling, or simply using the cafe as a base for other ventures, the establishment gave him visibility and a certain legitimacy in the neighborhood. Running a cafe in Little Italy during the 1920s, however, came with expectations. The neighborhood had an established order, controlled largely by Salvatore Sabella, who had emerged as the dominant figure in Philadelphia's Italian underworld. Sabella, a Sicilian immigrant who had built his power base through a combination of political connections, control of bootlegging operations, and strategic violence, maintained strict rules about business activities in his territory. Shop owners paid protection fees, a kind of informal tax that ensured their businesses wouldn't face vandalism, theft, or intimidation. These payments also bought access to certain services, help collecting debts, resolution of disputes, and a general shield against freelance criminals who might otherwise prey on small businessmen. It was a system that Sabella and his associates had carefully constructed, and challenges to this system were not taken lightly. Anthony Zanghi's relationship with Salvatore Sabella and the established Mafia structure began simply enough, with Zanghi borrowing money from the organization. In the world of Italian organized crime, loan sharking represented both a business opportunity and a way to create binding relationships. The loans were made at interest rates that far exceeded anything legal banks might charge, but they came without the paperwork, credit checks, or judgment that legitimate institutions demanded. For a young man like Zanghi, who likely lacked the collateral or credit history for conventional lending, these loans provided access to capital for whatever ventures he had in mind. Perhaps he used the money to establish or expand the La Tosca Cafe. Perhaps he invested in bootlegging inventory. The specific purpose matters less than what happened next. Zhang He returned to Sabella asking for more money. There was nothing unusual about this request in itself. Successful borrowers often returned for larger sums, and lenders profited from such ongoing relationships. But Sabella refused Zhang He's request for additional funds. More than that, he issued a direct warning: stay away from the shops in Little Italy that were already paying protection fees to the Mafia. This warning should have been clear enough. Sabella was drawing a line, telling Zhang He that certain business activities in certain territories were off limits unless he was operating as part of the Sabella organization. For a man of ambition but limited judgment, this presented a choice: accept the boundaries being imposed or press forward and face the consequences. Anthony Zhang He pressed forward. Reports from the time indicate that Zhang He continued to approach shops and businesses in Little Italy despite Sabella's explicit warning. Whether he was trying to muscle in on protection rackets, run his own parallel system, or simply collect what he felt he was owed, Zhang He was directly challenging Sabella's authority in Sabella's own territory. As if this weren't reckless enough, Zhang He also began trying to expand into bootlegging operations in areas controlled by Sabella's network. In the hierarchical world of organized crime, such behavior represented more than just business competition. It was a fundamental challenge to authority, a public questioning of whether Sabella could maintain control over his own neighborhood. Other young men watching this confrontation would take note. If Zhang He could openly defy Sabella without consequence, then perhaps Sabella's power wasn't as absolute as everyone believed. The Mafia boss faced a choice of his own: reassert control through violence or risk watching his authority slowly erode. For Salvatore Sabella it was, as they say, enough. The spring of 1927 had been particularly warm in Philadelphia. As Memorial Day approached, the city prepared for the traditional parade and cemetery visits that marked the holiday. In South Philadelphia's Italian district, the day held both American and Old World significance, a time to honor those who had died in war, but also to gather with family and community. On the evening of May 30th, 1927, Anthony Muskie Zhang He was spending time outside Cafe Calabria, located at 824 South 8th Street. With him was his younger brother Joseph Joe Zanghi, just 19 years old, and an associate named Vincent Scabby Cosa, 31. The three men stood in the warm evening air, perhaps discussing business, perhaps simply passing time in the way neighborhood men did on holiday evenings. They would not have been particularly alert to danger. Yes, Anthony knew he had angered Sabella, but he likely believed that his youth, his family connections, or perhaps simply the holiday itself offered some protection. In this he was catastrophically wrong. A vehicle approached on South 8th Street. Contemporary accounts describe it as a blue sedan, unremarkable except for what happened next. As the car drew even with the three men standing outside Cafe Calabria, gunmen inside opened fire. The sound of shotgun blasts echoed off the narrow row houses. In an instant, the peaceful Memorial Day evening transformed into chaos. Men and women screamed. People scattered for cover. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. And when the sedan sped away, two men lay dying on the sidewalk. Joseph Zhang He, the 19-year-old brother who had simply been standing with Anthony, was killed instantly. The shotgun blast had given him no chance to react, no moment to understand what was happening. Vincent Cosa, the associate, also fell mortally wounded. Both men died not because of their own actions, but because they happened to be standing next to the real target. Anthony Muskie Zhang He, demonstrating the quick reflexes that had perhaps kept him alive through years of street life, had dove for cover at the first sound of gunfire. He survived, uninjured physically but devastated emotionally. The assassination attempt had accomplished something the gunmen might not have intended. Rather than eliminating a problem, they had created something far more dangerous to the organization, a man with nothing left to lose. The days following the Memorial Day shooting saw Anthony Zanghi transformed. The arrogant street gangster who had challenged Sabella's authority was gone, replaced by a grief-stricken older brother consumed with rage and a desire for vengeance. But vengeance through traditional means, through the streets, through violence, through the code that governed Italian organized crime, seemed impossible. Sabella and his organization were too powerful, too well protected. A direct confrontation would simply result in Zanghi joining his brother in the cemetery. So Anthony Zanghi did something unprecedented in Philadelphia's Italian underworld. He went to the police. The Philadelphia Police Department, long frustrated by the code of silence that surrounded Italian organized crime, suddenly found themselves with a treasure beyond price. Here was an insider, someone who knew names and faces, who had been present at the shooting, who could provide the kind of detailed testimony that could crack open an entire organization. Detectives quickly arranged a lineup of suspects, gathering the men they believed were involved in the Memorial Day attack. What happened next at City Hall would become legendary in Philadelphia crime circles. As the suspects were brought into the lineup room, Anthony Zanghi did not simply point and nod. Instead, according to contemporary newspaper accounts, he erupted in fury. "There's the dirty rats that killed my brother," Zanghi shouted, using language that varied slightly between different reports. Some accounts record dirty dogs, others dirty rats, but the sentiment was identical. "Let me get at them." Detectives restrained him as he strained toward the lineup. Then, pointing directly at John Avina, one of Sabella's trusted men, Zanghi delivered a line that captured both his rage and his willingness to abandon all traditional codes. "Oh, you rat. Why did you fire when my back was turned?" The question itself was telling. Zanghi wasn't asking why they had attacked him. He knew he had provoked Sabella. He was asking why they had done it in such a cowardly manner, from a car without warning, killing his innocent brother in the process. It was the complaint of a man who understood street violence, but felt it should operate by certain rules, rules that had been violated in the most personal way possible. The identifications. As the lineup proceeded, Anthony Zanghi systematically identified the men he claimed were responsible for the Memorial Day attack. His identifications were specific and damning. John Avina, Zanghi accused him of firing the fatal shot that killed his brother Joseph. This was perhaps the most serious identification, as it named Avina as the direct killer of a 19-year-old. Luigi Quaranta Zanghi pointed to Quaranta as another shooter, specifically identifying him as the man who had killed Vincent Cocozza with a shotgun. Salvatore Sabella himself, Zanghi listed the boss among the actual shooters, placing him directly at the scene and participating in the violence rather than simply ordering it from a distance. John Scopoletti, identified as the driver of the automobile from which the shots were fired, making him an essential part of the conspiracy even if he hadn't pulled a trigger. Dominic Festa, arrested and named in connection with the shooting, though his exact role was less clearly defined in Zanghi's statements. Dominic Polina, known by the nickname Mr. Miggs, also arrested and identified by Zanghi as being involved in the attack. Norman Marcella from New Jersey, Nicholas Messino from New Jersey, Joseph Bruno from New Jersey, and John Marco from New Jersey. These four men were identified as being part of the broader conspiracy, suggesting the attack involved coordination between Philadelphia's organization and associates from across the Delaware River. In total, Zanghi placed 6 men directly at the scene of the shooting and named 4 others as being involved in the planning or support. For prosecutors, this represented the kind of detailed insider testimony that was almost impossible to obtain in cases involving organized crime. Some accounts from that day at City Hall included an even more dramatic detail, that Zanghi physically attacked Sabella during the proceedings, punching the Mafia boss in front of police and court officials. Whether this actually occurred or represents embellishment in later retellings, the story captured the fury and desperation that Zanghi displayed during this period. After making his identifications, Zanghi seemed to recognize the magnitude of what he had done. According to newspaper reports, he told police, I've done something I never thought any cop could ever make me do. I've squealed. I'll be killed now for sure, but I don't care. My brother is dead, and I loved my brother. This statement reveals the conflict within Zhang He. He understood that he had violated the most fundamental rule of his world. He knew that informing on Mafia members carried a death sentence that was only a matter of timing. But in that moment, consumed by grief and rage, the future consequences seemed less important than the immediate desire for justice or revenge. The vanishing witness. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office moved quickly to build a case around Zhang He's testimony. Grand jury indictments were secured against Sabella and his men. The prospect of putting a mafia boss on trial for murder, with an insider as the star witness, generated significant attention. For prosecutors who had long struggled to penetrate the code of silence surrounding Italian organized crime, this represented a breakthrough moment. But as the legal proceedings moved forward, something unexpected happened. Anthony Zhang He disappeared. The official record simply notes that Zhang He failed to appear for testimony as the trials proceeded. He had been there for the initial identifications, had given statements to police, had cooperated with the grand jury investigation. But when the time came for actual courtroom testimony under oath, where defense attorneys could cross-examine him and test his story, Anthony Muskie Zhang He could not be found. Rumors immediately spread through both law enforcement circles and the underworld about what had happened. The most persistent story, repeated in numerous historical accounts, was that Zhang He had been paid $50,000 to vanish. In 1927, $50,000 represented an enormous sum, equivalent to roughly $1 million in current purchasing power. It was enough money to start over somewhere else, to disappear into another city or perhaps even another country, to live comfortably without ever needing to work. The question that naturally follows is, who paid him? Several possibilities exist. Sabella's organization, facing the prospect of their boss being convicted based on Zhang He's testimony, would have had strong motivation to make him disappear. $50,000, while expensive, was far cheaper than losing Sabella to the electric chair or life imprisonment. The payment could have been framed as both a bribe and a life insurance policy. Take the money and disappear, or refuse and face certain death. Alternatively, some historians have speculated that other criminal organizations, concerned about the precedent that Zhang He's cooperation was setting, might have contributed to a fund to pay him off. If one gangster could openly inform and survive through witness protection, others might follow. The entire code of Omerta, which had protected organized crime for generations, could begin to crumble. There's also the possibility that Zhang He's own family, horrified by what he had done and fearful of the retribution that would inevitably follow, helped facilitate his disappearance. With 13 children in the Zhang He family, Anthony's actions endangered not just himself but his siblings and parents. Helping him vanish might have been seen as both protecting him and protecting the rest of the family from association with an informant. Whatever the truth, Anthony Zhang He effectively disappeared from the Philadelphia court system's reach in late 1927. The prosecution, having lost their star witness, scrambled to salvage their case. Fortunately for them, they had a backup, a man named Piero Francisco, known in some documents as Peter Francisco. Francisco had also witnessed the Memorial Day shooting, though from a different vantage point than Zhang He. When called to testify, he provided detailed descriptions that corroborated much of what Zhang He had initially told police. Francisco testified that he had seen John Scopoletti driving the blue sedan from which the shots were fired. He identified Luigi Quaranta in the rear of the vehicle with a shotgun. He also named Dominic Festa as another shotgun man, providing prosecutors with multiple witnesses placing specific defendants at the scene. But Francisco's decision to testify came with immediate and severe consequences. In the world of Italian organized crime, witnesses were not tolerated. Francisco soon found himself the target of multiple assassination attempts. The specifics of these attempts are not detailed in surviving records, but the fact that they were numerous enough to be noteworthy suggests sustained and determined efforts to silence him. The Philadelphia police, recognizing that Francisco was their only remaining pathway to convictions in the case, placed him in protective custody. For approximately 20 months, nearly 2 years, Francisco lived under constant guard, unable to move freely, separated from his family and community, existing in a kind of limbo between the legitimate world and the criminal underworld. The psychological toll of such extended protective custody can hardly be overstated. Francisco lived knowing that men were actively trying to kill him, that his testimony had marked him for death, and that even with police protection, there were no guarantees of safety. Every day brought the possibility that someone would find him, that the protection would fail, that he would end up like the men he had testified against wanted to end up, dead in the street. Finally, in March 1929, the authorities made a decision. Francisco was quietly shipped back to Italy. The official story was that he was being sent home for his own safety, removed from the immediate danger that his testimony had created. In reality, it was likely an acknowledgement that indefinite protective custody was unsustainable, and that Francisco's usefulness as a witness had come to an end. Despite losing their primary witness and eventually losing their backup witness to deportation, prosecutors did manage to secure some convictions. Luigi Quaranta, identified by both Zanghi and Francisco as one of the shooters, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For a brief moment, it appeared that law enforcement had managed to overcome the code of silence and hold members of the Philadelphia Mafia accountable for a brazen public assassination. Quaranta's conviction represented a significant victory, even if it fell short of bringing down Sabella and the entire organization. But the victory proved temporary. Quaranta's attorneys filed appeals, challenging various aspects of the conviction. In a legal system that afforded multiple opportunities for appeal and review, they found sympathetic ears. Eventually, Quaranta's conviction was overturned. The specific grounds for the reversal are not clearly documented in readily available sources, but the result was clear. The man identified as one of the Memorial Day shooters walked free. Salvatore Sabella, despite being named by Zanghi as one of the shooters, never faced conviction for the Memorial Day attack. He would continue to operate as boss of the Philadelphia Mafia until his retirement to Italy in 1931. The organization he had defended through violence remained intact, and the message was clear: challenging the established order brought death, and even those who cooperated with law enforcement could not guarantee convictions. After disappearing from Philadelphia in 1927, Anthony Zanghi vanished from the historical record for several years. What we do know is that by 1934, roughly 7 years after the Memorial Day shooting, Anthony Zanghi was in New York City. What is documented is that during his time in New York, Zanghi became involved in a counterfeiting operation. Counterfeiting represented a different type of criminal enterprise than the bootlegging and protection rackets that had characterized organized crime during Prohibition. By 1934, Prohibition had been repealed, fundamentally changing the economics of organized crime. Criminals who had grown wealthy on bootlegging needed new income streams, and counterfeiting offered one such opportunity. Zanghi's partner in this operation was a man named Anthony Cugino. The two men apparently worked together producing and distributing counterfeit currency, though the scale of their operation and how long it had been running remain unknown. What is clear is that at some point the partnership deteriorated. Whether they fought over money, over division of responsibilities, over some personal slight, or over the direction of their criminal enterprise, the relationship between Zanghi and Cugino broke down completely. On the evening of August 7, 1934, Anthony Muskie Zanghi was shot and killed on a Manhattan street. The details of the shooting, the exact location, the time, the circumstances, are sparsely documented in readily available historical sources. What is known is that the murder occurred in a manner consistent with organized crime killings, quick, public enough to send a message, but anonymous enough that immediate identification of the shooter proved difficult. Law enforcement quickly focused on Anthony Cugino as the primary suspect. The falling out over their counterfeiting operation provided clear motive. Cugino had both opportunity and reason to want Zhang He dead. Detectives arrested Cugino and began building a case for murder. But before formal arraignment could proceed, before prosecutors could present their evidence in court, Anthony Cugino took his own life. On September 8, 1935, more than a year after Zhang He's murder, Cugino committed suicide in his holding cell. The specific method of suicide is not detailed in most historical accounts, but the result was the same. The only suspect in Zhang He's murder was dead, and the case would never go to trial. Cugino's suicide raises several questions that cannot be definitively answered. Was it an act of guilt, a criminal unable to face the prospect of conviction and execution for murder? Was it fear concern that others involved in the counterfeiting operation might testify against him, or worry about what might happen to him in prison given his association with Zhang He, a known informant? Or was it, as some in law enforcement undoubtedly suspected, not suicide at all, but rather a murder made to look like suicide, eliminating a potential witness, who might have revealed embarrassing details about the counterfeiting operation or other criminal enterprises? The truth died with Cugino in that holding cell. What remains is simply the fact Anthony Muskie Zhang He, who had broken the code of silence in 1927 and somehow survived 7 more years, finally met the violent end that had been predicted from the moment he pointed at those men in the City Hall lineup. Chapter 15. End of Sabella's Era. The final years of Salvatore Sabella's reign unfolded against a backdrop of profound transformation in the American underworld. As the 1920s drew to a close, the aging Don found himself drawn into a conflict that would reshape organized crime forever, the Castellamares War. A struggle that pitted traditional Sicilian values against a new generation's vision of criminal enterprise. In the spring of 1929, Sabella made a decision that would define his legacy among the old guard. When Salvatore Maranzano, leader of the Castellamarese clan in Brooklyn, called for support against Joe Masseria, Sabella answered without hesitation. The Philadelphia Don assembled a contingent of 9 experienced gunmen, men who had proven their loyalty through years of service to the family. Together they traveled north to New York, establishing themselves in Brooklyn to bolster Maranzano's forces. This commitment revealed much about Sabella's worldview. Maranzano represented everything the Philadelphia Don held sacred: Sicilian tradition, the old codes of honor, respect for established hierarchy. Joe Masseria, by contrast, embodied a dangerous pragmatism, willing to work with criminals of any background, Italian or otherwise, if it served his purposes. For Sabella, this wasn't merely a territorial dispute. It was a struggle for the soul of organized crime itself. The Philadelphia contingent operated quietly in Brooklyn, following Sabella's characteristically measured approach. They provided reinforcement during tense moments, served as intermediaries in delicate negotiations, and demonstrated Philadelphia's unwavering support for the conservative Sicilian faction. Sabella himself remained largely in Philadelphia, managing his legitimate butcher business while coordinating his family's involvement from a distance. The war dragged on through 1929 and into 1930, a period of mounting tension and sporadic violence. For Sabella, now in his 60s, the conflict must have felt increasingly foreign. The younger men engaged in the struggle showed little regard for the traditions he had spent decades upholding. They were brasher, more willing to draw attention, less concerned with the subtle arrangements that had allowed men like Sabella to operate in the shadows for so long. In 1931, Sabella's own fortunes took a troubling turn. During a trip to northern New Jersey, the aging Don was arrested following an incident involving assault and battery with a motor vehicle. The details of the confrontation remain obscure, lost to history's margins. What is known is that Sabella, perhaps benefiting from his advanced age and lack of prior convictions, received a suspended sentence. The judge's leniency allowed him to return to Philadelphia, but the arrest served as an unwelcome reminder that even the most careful operators could find themselves entangled with law enforcement. By the time Joe Masseria fell to assassins' bullets in a Coney Island restaurant in April of 1931, the outcome of the Castellamares War seemed decided. Salvatore Maranzano had emerged victorious, and for a brief moment it appeared that the old ways might prevail. Maranzano moved quickly to reorganize New York's criminal landscape, establishing the five-family structure that would govern the city's underworld for generations to come. Sabella watched these developments with cautious optimism. His ally had won. The traditional Sicilian approach to organized crime appeared vindicated. Maranzano spoke of bringing order to chaos, of establishing clear hierarchies and territories, of maintaining the ancient codes that men like Sabella held dear. But the victory proved hollow and devastatingly brief. On September 10, 1931, Salvatore Maranzano was murdered in his Manhattan office. The assassination, orchestrated by younger mobsters including Charles Lucky, Luciano, and Meyer Lansky, marked a definitive turning point. The Mustache Petus, the old guard Sicilian traditionists like Maranzano and Sabella, had lost not just a battle, but the war for organized crime's future. The new generation that seized power advocated for cooperation across ethnic lines. They saw the old Sicilian prejudices as limiting and counterproductive. In their vision, Italian criminals would work alongside Jewish gangsters, Irish bootleggers, and anyone else who could contribute to profitable enterprises. Territory mattered more than heritage. Business acumen trumped old-world traditions. For Salvatore Sabella, the message was unmistakable. The world he had helped build, the careful balance he had maintained in Philadelphia for more than a decade, belonged to a fading era. At 61 years old, he recognized that his time as a power in organized crime had passed. The decision to step aside came naturally to a man who had always valued pragmatism over pride. Sabella designated his successor with characteristic care, selecting John Avina to lead the Philadelphia family into this uncertain new era. Avina, younger and more adaptable to the changing landscape, would guide the organization through the transitions ahead. Sabella's retirement was gradual and graceful. He returned his full attention to the butcher shop that had served as his front for so many years, finding perhaps unexpected satisfaction in honest work. The store on Christian Street continued to serve South Philadelphia's Italian community, and Sabella himself could often be found behind the counter, preparing cuts of meat with the same precision he had once applied to organizing criminal enterprises. The former Don lived out his remaining years in relative peace, watching from the sidelines as the organization he had built evolved under new leadership. He maintained relationships with old associates, attended family gatherings, and participated in the social life of South Philadelphia's Italian community. To most neighbors, he was simply Salvatore Sabella, the respected butcher who had immigrated from Sicily decades earlier and built a successful business through hard work and dedication. Law enforcement, of course, knew differently. Federal agents and local police maintained sporadic surveillance of the aging gangster, but Sabella gave them little to observe. His days of active criminal management were over, and he seemed content to let younger men navigate the increasingly complex world of American organized crime. As the 1930s progressed, Sabella watched his successor John Avina face challenges that would have tested any leader. The end of Prohibition in 1933 eliminated the bootlegging revenues that had enriched every crime family in America. The Philadelphia organization, like others across the country, needed to adapt quickly, finding new sources of income and establishing new territories of control. Sabella offered counsel when asked, but he resisted any temptation to interfere. He had chosen Avina as his successor, and he trusted that choice. The old Don understood that each generation must find its own path, even if that path diverged from the traditions he held sacred. In his final years, Salvatore Sabella presented a study in contrasts. To the broader world, he was a successful small businessman, a pillar of South Philadelphia's Italian community. To those who knew the truth, he was the founding father of Philadelphia's organized crime family, a man who had shaped the city's underworld during its most formative years. Both versions were authentic, Both reflected aspects of this complex, careful man who had navigated between two worlds with singular skill. Sabella died in 1946 at the age of 71, his passing noted in Philadelphia's newspapers as that of a long-time local businessman. The obituaries made no mention of his years as a crime boss, his role in the Castellamares War, or his place in the history of American organized crime. He was remembered, at least publicly, as he had lived his later years, a quiet butcher who had served his community. The funeral drew a large crowd, a mix of legitimate business people, family members, and old associates who understood Sabella's true significance. They laid him to rest with the respect due to a man who had shaped an era, even if that era had passed into history. Salvatore Sabella's legacy extended far beyond his own lifetime. The organization he had founded in the early 1920s would continue operating in Philadelphia for decades to come, adapting to new challenges and opportunities while maintaining some connection to the principles he had established. The careful approach to law enforcement, the emphasis on maintaining legitimate business fronts, the preference for negotiation over violence, these elements of Sabella's leadership style would echo through subsequent generations of Philadelphia organized crime. But perhaps his most significant contribution was demonstrating that organized crime, like any other enterprise, required more than violence and intimidation to succeed. It demanded planning, diplomacy, and the ability to build lasting relationships across complex social landscapes. Sabella had brought a butcher's precision to the business of crime, carefully measuring each decision, wasting nothing, and building an organization that could sustain itself beyond any single leader's tenure. As we close this examination of Salvatore Sabella's life and career, we're left with a portrait of a man who embodied the contradictions of his time. He was a criminal who valued order, a boss who preferred peace, a Sicilian traditionalist who adapted to American realities. He built an empire in the shadows while maintaining a respectable public face. He helped establish organized crime in Philadelphia, then stepped aside when the world changed around him. The butcher shop on Christian Street eventually passed to other hands, as did leadership of the criminal organization Sabella had founded. But the story of this careful, calculating man who came from Sicily with nothing and shaped Philadelphia's underworld remains a fascinating chapter. In the broader history of American organized crime, a story of ambition and adaptation, tradition and transformation, violence and surprising restraint. In the end, Salvatore Sabella achieved what few crime bosses ever do. He chose his own exit on his own terms and lived to old age in relative peace. For a man who had spent decades navigating one of the most dangerous professions imaginable, it was perhaps the greatest success of all.